Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind and step gently into the sun-drenched hills of ancient Italy, where a mysterious people built cities of stone, painted tombs with scenes of joy, and then vanished so completely that even their name was nearly forgotten. Each episode here isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the lives lived, the stories whispered through weathered stones and ancient manuscripts. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, a like and a subscribe help keep this channel alive. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. Before Rome conquered the world, before Caesar crossed the Rubicon, before the Colosseum rose against the sky, there was another civilization in Italy. They built cities of stone and painted tombs, with frescoes of dancers and musicians. They wore gold jewelry so intricate it rivals anything made today. They developed engineering techniques that Rome would later claim as its own. And then, almost completely, they disappeared. Their name was Etruscan, though even that name comes to us through Roman sources, filtered through the lens of conquerors. We know they existed because we found their cities, their tombs, their art. We've stood in chambers they carved into hillsides 2,500 years ago and seen frescoes so vivid they seem painted yesterday. We've held mirrors they engraved with mythological scenes, read inscriptions in a language we still cannot fully translate, touched gold that once adorned the necks of people whose names we will never know. Yet for centuries, they were almost entirely forgotten. The Romans absorbed their culture, adopted their technology, built upon their foundations, and then wrote them out of history. Roman authors mention them only in passing, usually as enemies conquered, as primitive, people civilized by Rome's superior culture. The Etruscans built the first true cities in Italy, taught the Romans how to build arches and drain swamps, gave them their religious practices and their taste for spectacle. And Rome thanked them by erasing nearly every trace of their existence. When Renaissance scholars began studying ancient texts, they read about Greece and Rome, Athens and Sparta, Alexandria and Carthage. The Etruscans appeared only as footnotes, mysterious people who existed before the real history began. Their cities lay buried under medieval towns, their tombs sealed beneath Tuscan hillsides, their language locked in inscriptions no one could read. It was as if an entire civilization had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions written in an alphabet that looked almost familiar but meant nothing anyone could understand. But they did not vanish completely. In the hills of Tuscany and Umbria, in the volcanic landscape of Lazio, beneath vineyards and olive groves, their legacy waited. Tombs carved into soft tufa stone, frescoes depicting banquets and athletic games. Sarcophagi, showing married couples reclining together with expressions of tenderness rarely seen in ancient art. Bronze statues of warriors and priests. Gold jewelry worked with techniques that baffle modern craftsmen. Inscriptions in a language that stands alone, related to no other known tongue, defying every attempt at full translation. The Etruscans left behind one of history's greatest mysteries. Who were they? Where did they come from? Why did their civilization flourish for centuries and then disappear so completely that even the Romans who conquered them preserved almost nothing of their story? These questions haunted scholars for generations, sparked debates that continue today, and reveal something profound about how easily the past can be erased, how thoroughly victors can rewrite history. This is not a story about primitive tribes or barbarian hordes. This is a story about a sophisticated civilization that built cities before Rome existed, that created art, celebrating life with a joy rarely seen in the ancient world, that gave women rights unthinkable in Greece or early Rome, that developed religious and engineering practices that would shape Western civilization. This is a story about how that civilization was systematically absorbed, suppressed, and nearly forgotten, until archaeologists began opening tombs in the 18th century and found a lost world painted on underground walls. The Etruscan Enigma begins with a simple fact that seems impossible. Before Rome ruled Italy, before Latin became the language of an empire, another people built 12 great city-states across the Italian peninsula. They traded with Greeks and Carthaginians, mined iron and copper, created art that influenced everyone who saw it. They were wealthy, sophisticated, powerful, and then they were gone, leaving behind treasures in tombs and questions in a language no one speaks. How does a civilization disappear? How do centuries of culture, language, religion, and art become footnotes in someone else's history? How do we lose the voices of an entire people, preserving only their possessions and the biased accounts of their conquerors? These questions matter because the Etruscan disappearance was not unique. It was simply one of the most complete. And in understanding how it happened, we understand something essential about history itself, about how the past is recorded, preserved, or erased. So let us step back through time, past the Roman Empire, past the Republic, past the legendary founding of Rome itself, to a world before Romulus and Remus, before the Capitoline Hill held temples, to the rolling hills of central Italy in the 8th century before Christ, where a mysterious people were building cities and creating art that would one day be called impossible by those who finally found it again. The year is 750 before the Common Era. The hills of central Italy roll beneath an endless sky, covered in forests of oak and chestnut. Rivers cut through volcanic valleys, their waters clear and cold. The coastline stretches along the Tyrrhenian Sea, where Greek traders sail north and Phoenician merchants sail south. And somewhere in between, a culture is rising that will define this land for centuries. This is not yet Rome. Rome is barely a collection of villages, shepherds and farmers living in huts on 7 muddy hills beside the Tiber River. But to the north, in the land that will one day be called Tuscany, 12 cities already stand. Tarquinia, Cerveteri, Veii, Volci, Vetulonia, Populonia, Volterra, Chiusi, Perugia, Cortona, Arezzo, Fiesole. These are not primitive settlements. These are true cities, built of stone, surrounded by walls, governed by kings called Lucumones, connected by trade and religion and a shared identity. The Etruscans call themselves Rasenna. The Greeks call them Tyrannoi. The Romans will call them Tusci or Etrusci. But they call themselves Rasenna, though even that name comes to us filtered through other languages, and we cannot be entirely certain how they pronounced it or what it meant. They speak a language unlike any other in Italy, unlike Latin or the Italic dialects spoken by other tribes. Their alphabet looks Greek, borrowed from colonies to the south, but their words are their own, and they remain largely undeciphered even now. Walk through Tarquinia in this distant time. The city sits on a plateau overlooking the sea, protected by walls of squared stone. Inside, streets grid the settlement in organised blocks, something unprecedented in Italy. Houses rise 2 or 3 stories, built of wood and clay brick, with terracotta roof tiles that will become a hallmark of Mediterranean architecture. Temples crown the highest points, their columns painted bright red and yellow, their pediments decorated with terracotta sculptures of gods and monsters. In the Agora, merchants trade goods from across the Mediterranean: Phoenician glass, Greek pottery, Egyptian scarabs, amber from the distant north, bronze from Etruscan mines. Women walk unveiled, wearing elaborate jewellery, pleated dresses, pointed shoes. They speak with men as equals, attend banquets reclining on couches, their presence at public events unremarkable. This equality will shock Greek visitors and scandalise Roman historians, but here it is simply life. Outside the city walls, the landscape is dotted with tombs, not simple graves, but chambers carved into hillsides, complete rooms underground furnished for the afterlife. The Etruscans believe death is not an ending but a transition, and they prepare for it lavishly. Inside these tombs, they paint frescoes showing the life they hope continues. Banquets and music, athletic competitions and dancing. They fill chambers with everything the dead might need: furniture and jewellery, weapons and tools, wine amphorae and grain storage, jars. The Etruscan world is not a unified empire. Each city governs itself, ruled by a king and a council of nobles. But every spring, representatives from all 12 cities gather at the sanctuary of Voltumna, near modern Orvieto, to celebrate shared religious festivals, settle disputes, and coordinate defence. This loose confederation works because the cities share language, religion, and culture. They worship the same gods, follow the same augury traditions, recognize the same sacred boundaries. Their religion permeates everything. Etruscan priests, called haruspices, read divine will by examining animal livers, interpreting lightning strikes, observing bird flight. They divide the sky into 16 regions, each governed by different gods, and they record their interpretations in sacred books. These practices will later be adopted wholesale by Rome, becoming central to Roman state religion, though few Romans will remember they came from the Etruscans. The economy thrives on mining and metallurgy. The hills of Tuscany hold rich deposits of iron, copper, and tin. Etruscan smiths forge bronze of exceptional quality, creating armor, weapons, tools, and artworks that spread throughout the Mediterranean. Their bucchero pottery, black and shiny, becomes a trade commodity recognizable everywhere. Their goldwork reaches levels of technical sophistication that some modern jewelers struggle to replicate, using granulation techniques so fine that individual gold grains are barely visible to the naked eye. But perhaps what most defines this world is its embrace of life. The tomb frescoes do not show grim underworlds or fearsome judgments. They show banquets where people recline on couches, musicians play double flutes and lyres, dancers move with joyful abandon. They show athletic competitions, foot races and discus throwing, wrestling and chariot racing. They show fishing and hunting, farming and gathering. The Etruscans paint death as a continuation of the pleasures of life, and in doing so, they reveal a culture that celebrated existence rather than fearing its end. This is the world before Rome, before Latin, before the empire that will conquer the known world. This is Italy when it spoke Etruscan, when cities thrived on these hills, when trade ships carried goods north and south along the coast, when priests read omens in lightning and livers, when women owned property and attended banquets, when artists created works that would not be equalled for 1,000 years. It is a world on the verge of change. To the south, Rome is growing, absorbing Etruscan influence, learning Etruscan engineering, even ruled by Etruscan kings. To the east, other Italic tribes watch with envy. To the north, Celtic peoples are moving south through the Alps. The Etruscan world sits at the centre of Italy, wealthy and sophisticated, seemingly eternal. But nothing is eternal. Civilizations rise and fall. Languages disappear. Cities crumble. And sometimes, the fall is so complete that centuries pass before anyone remembers what was lost. The Etruscan world of 750 BCE does not know it is living in a golden age that will end, that its language will die, that its cities will be absorbed, that its very existence will become a mystery. For now, though, the frescoes are being painted, the gold is being worked, the cities are thriving. For now, the Ravenna live in their world, speak their language, worship their gods, and leave behind treasures that will wait in darkness for 2,000 years before human eyes see them again. The spring of 1726, an Italian peasant named Alessandro, working in a vineyard near the town of Volterra in Tuscany, drives his plough into soft earth and feels it catch on something hard. He stops, kneels, brushes away dirt, and sees bronze. Not just a fragment, but a large object, smooth and curved. He digs carefully, the way farmers learn to do when they find things in these ancient hills, and he uncovers a statue, a boy with his arm extended, perfectly preserved. This is how the Etruscan revival begins, not with scholarly expeditions or royal commissions, but with a farmer in a field, finding beauty in the dirt. The statue will become famous as the shadow of the evening, l'ombra della sera, a bronze figure so elongated it seems to stretch like a shadow at sunset. But in 1726, it is simply strange and wonderful, clearly ancient, clearly valuable, and clearly made by people who knew what they were doing. Word spreads. Other farmers begin reporting finds. Near Tarquinia, a landowner exploring his property discovers a painted tomb. The entrance is sealed with earth and stones, but when he clears it and descends with torches, he finds walls covered in frescoes, colours still bright after more than 2,000 years. Figures recline at banquets, musicians play instruments, athletes compete in games. The style is unlike Roman art, unlike Greek art. It is something else, something older, something lost. The 18th century awakens to antiquity. Pompeii and Herculaneum are being excavated, revealing Roman life frozen in ash. But these Etruscan discoveries are different. They predate Rome. They suggest a civilization that existed before the empire, before the republic, before the legendary founding itself. And they raise questions no one can answer. Who painted these tombs? What language are these inscriptions written in? Where did these people come from, and where did they go? Scholars descend on Tuscany and northern Lazio. They open tomb after tomb, finding chambers carved into soft volcanic tufa, decorated with painted scenes of daily life and religious ritual. They find sarcophagi showing married couples reclining together, the husband's arm around his wife's shoulder, both with serene expressions, archaic smiles suggesting contentment in death. They find gold jewellery of extraordinary workmanship, bronze mirrors engraved with mythological scenes, pottery marked with inscriptions in an unknown script. The inscriptions become an obsession. They are written in an alphabet clearly derived from Greek, brought to Italy by colonists in the 8th century BCE. The letters can be read, but the words make no sense. Scholars try to force them into Latin, into Greek, into Celtic languages, into everything they know. Nothing works. The Etruscan language stands alone, related to nothing, comprehensible only in fragments, maddeningly close to understanding but ultimately opaque. Some inscriptions are short, just names and dates on tombstones. Others are longer, religious texts or dedications, but without a bilingual key, without a Rosetta Stone equivalent. Translation remains guesswork. Scholars learn that me means I, that Zilath means magistrate, that Suthi means tomb. They identify gods, Tinia is Jupiter, Uni is Juno, Minerva is Minerva, but full sentences remain mysterious, and the grammar defies all attempts to establish clear rules. Meanwhile, the treasures keep emerging. In 1728, the Regolini Galassi tomb at Cerveteri is opened, revealing one of the richest burials ever found. Gold fibulae, bracelets, necklaces, all worked with granulation so fine it seems impossible without magnification. A parade helmet, breastplates, shields, all bronze, all perfectly preserved. The woman buried there, probably a princess or queen, was laid to rest, surrounded by wealth that speaks to a civilization at its height. By 1750, Etruscan fever grips Europe. Wealthy collectors commission excavations, museums compete for artifacts, artists study Etruscan designs, incorporating them into contemporary work, but the more they find, the deeper the mystery becomes. This was clearly a major civilization, sophisticated and wealthy, yet Roman authors barely mentioned it. Livy and Virgil referenced Etruscans only as enemies Rome conquered. Pliny and Strabo described them as foreigners, possibly from the East, possibly indigenous, but offered no clear history. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, claimed the Etruscans came from Lydia in Asia Minor, driven by famine to migrate to Italy. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing centuries later, insisted they were native Italians, indigenous people who developed their culture in place. Neither provided proof. Neither explained how they became so sophisticated or why they disappeared so completely. And neither explained the language, which remained unlike any other in Europe or the Mediterranean. 18th century scholars begin writing books attempting to solve the Etruscan Enigma. Thomas Dempster publishes De Etruria Regali in 1723, arguing the Etruscans were the true founders of Italian civilization. Luigi Lanzi catalogues Etruscan inscriptions, creating the first systematic attempt at linguistic analysis. Giovanni Gori founds the Etruscan Academy in Cortona, dedicated to studying this lost culture. But for every question they answer, 3 more emerge. The discoveries continue. Near Chiusi, workers building a road uncover an underground chamber filled with cremation urns, each decorated with reliefs showing scenes from the deceased's life. Near Volci, tomb robbers accidentally discover the Francois tomb, its walls painted with historical and mythological scenes, including battles between Roman and Etruscan warriors. Near Tarquinia, the tomb of the leopards is found, its frescoes showing a banquet so vivid, so full of life and joy, that viewers stand transfixed, unable to reconcile these images with the common perception of ancient life as brutal and short. By the end of the 18th century, one thing is clear. The Etruscans were not a minor culture, not a footnote to Roman history. They were a major civilization, perhaps the first true civilization in Italy, and their disappearance represents one of history's great mysteries. How does a people this sophisticated, this wealthy, this artistically accomplished, vanish so completely that their own neighbours forget them? How does their language die so thoroughly that no one speaks it, no one remembers it, no one even knows what family of languages it belonged to? These questions hang in the air as the 19th century begins, as excavations continue, as museums fill with artifacts, as scholars struggle to read inscriptions written in a language that refuses to be understood. The Etruscans have returned from obscurity, but they have returned as a mystery, and the mystery is only deepening. The learned societies of Europe react to the Etruscan discoveries with a mixture of fascination and professional caution. At the Royal Society in London, scholars examine drawings of tomb frescoes and debate their authenticity. At the Académie Française in Paris, linguists study copies of inscriptions and argue about their meaning. In Rome itself, the papal antiquarians view these findings with both pride and suspicion. Pride that Italy's heritage extends deeper than Rome, suspicion that this might somehow diminish Roman glory. The skeptics arrive first, as they always do when something unexpected challenges accepted history. How can we be certain these tombs are not Roman? How do we know the artifacts are as old as claimed? Might the inscriptions be elaborate frauds, created by clever forgers to sell to gullible collectors? The 18th century has seen its share of archaeological hoaxes, and the scholars are right to be careful. But the evidence keeps accumulating, and careful dating based on pottery styles, artistic comparisons with Greek work, and the sheer number of sites make fraud increasingly implausible. The argument shifts. If the Etruscans were real, if they truly predated Rome, then who were they? The ancient sources offer contradictory accounts, and modern scholars line up behind different theories, like generals choosing sides in a war. One faction follows Herodotus, insisting the Etruscans were migrants from the eastern Mediterranean, probably Lydia in modern Turkey. The evidence seems compelling. Herodotus was close to the events in historical terms. Eastern influence appears in Etruscan art and religion, and the Etruscans themselves supposedly maintain traditions about their Eastern origin. Another faction follows Dionysius of Halicarnassus, arguing the Etruscans were indigenous Italians who developed their civilization in place. This group points to the continuity of settlement in Tuscany from the Bronze Age forward, the presence of similar cultural practices in surrounding regions, and the problems with the migration theory. How does an entire population cross the Mediterranean and settle in Italy without leaving clear traces along the way? Where are the intermediate sites, the evidence of journey, the cultural transition? A third group proposes compromise. Perhaps the Etruscans were indigenous people influenced by Eastern traders and settlers, a fusion culture that drew from both native traditions and imported ideas. This theory attempts to reconcile the contradictions, but satisfies no one completely. The Eastern faction insists the cultural evidence is too strong for mere influence. The indigenous faction argues that influence is exactly what the evidence shows, not migration. The debate extends to Etruscan accomplishments. When scholars study the engineering of Etruscan cities, they find sophisticated water management systems, underground drainage tunnels, planned street grids. Some argue this proves Eastern origin, since such techniques were known in the Near East. Others insist it proves indigenous development, since the Etruscans adapted these techniques to Italian geography in ways that show deep local knowledge. The same artifacts become evidence for opposing theories. The public, meanwhile, is entranced. Wealthy Europeans tour Tuscany to see the painted tombs. Artists sketch Etruscan designs. Poets write verses imagining Etruscan life. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe visits Italy and writes about Etruscan art with admiration. The Romantics especially embrace the Etruscans, seeing in them a pre-Roman purity, a civilization that celebrated life and beauty before the austere pragmatism of Roman power trampled it. But this romantic vision troubles some scholars. Are we projecting modern sensibilities onto ancient art? The tomb frescoes show banquets and dancing, but they are funeral art, not documentary evidence of daily life. The equality suggested for Etruscan women comes largely from these same tomb paintings, which show couples together, women reclining at banquets, female figures in prominent positions. Is this evidence of social equality, or artistic convention, or religious symbolism? The sources are ambiguous, and interpretation depends partly on what the interpreter wants to find. The linguistic mystery deepens the disagreement. If the Etruscan language were clearly related to Greek, Latin, or any known language family, it would support one theory or another. But Etruscan stands alone. Some scholars claim they see Eastern influences in the vocabulary, words that might be Anatolian or pre-Indo-European. Others insist the language shows indigenous development, evolved in place over centuries. Still others suggest it might be a language isolate, unrelated to anything, a survivor from some prehistoric language family now extinct everywhere else. Religious practices provide another battleground. Etruscan divination, the reading of omens from lightning and animal entrails, has parallels in Mesopotamia and Anatolia. Does this prove Eastern origin? Or does it simply reflect common human attempts to communicate with gods, developed independently in different places? The Roman adoption of Etruscan religious practices is well documented. Roman augurs and haruspices explicitly learned their craft from Etruscan teachers. But does this prove Etruscan sophistication, or merely Roman superstition? By 1800, the arguments have calcified into opposing camps, each convinced of its correctness, each interpreting new evidence to support pre-existing conclusions. Archaeological method is still developing, and systematic excavation with careful recording is rare. Most discoveries come from tomb robbers and amateur enthusiasts who care more about treasure than context. The artifacts reach museums, stripped of the information that might settle debates. A beautiful bronze mirror is just a beautiful bronze mirror, its value in the market known, its value as evidence lost. Yet beneath the academic disagreements, a consensus slowly emerges. Whatever their origin, whoever they were, the Etruscans were a major civilization that profoundly influenced Roman culture. The Romans learned architecture from them, borrowed religious practices, adopted aspects of government and social organization. Roman names like Marcus, Publius, and Gnaeus are Etruscan, Roman. Engineering techniques, the arch and the vault, the drainage system and the road building show Etruscan influence. Even the Roman triumph, the victory parade, derives from Etruscan ritual. The wonder, then, is not that the Etruscans existed, but that they vanished so completely. The skepticism is not about whether they were real, but about whether we can ever truly know them. Their tombs speak, but in a language only partially understood. Their art reveals, but raises more questions than it answers. Their cities endure, but transformed by Roman rebuilding, medieval settlement, modern occupation, layers upon layers obscuring the original. The scholars of the early 19th century stand at the beginning of a journey that will take 200 years and still not reach its destination. They have found a lost civilization. Or rather, they have found traces of a lost civilization. Now they must decide what those traces mean, where these people came from, how they lived, and why they disappeared. The answers will remain elusive, shifting with each new discovery, each new interpretation, each generation's different questions. The Roman historians painted the Etruscans with two colours, and neither matched what archaeologists were finding in the tombs. On one hand, Roman writers acknowledged Etruscan influence, admitted Rome's early kings were Etruscan, conceded that Roman religion and engineering owed debts to their northern neighbours. On the other hand, these same writers described Etruscans as effeminate, decadent, morally corrupt, slaves to luxury and superstition, people who needed Roman conquest to be civilized. Livy wrote that Etruscan cities were wealthy but weak, devoted to pleasure, unable to resist Roman virtue and military discipline. He described Etruscan banquets as orgies, Etruscan society as matriarchal in ways Romans found disturbing, Etruscan religion as excessive and irrational. His accounts drip with contempt, wrapped in admiration, the way conquerors often write about the conquered, acknowledging their achievements while justifying their subjugation. But the tombs told a different story. The frescoes showed banquets, yes, but not orgies. They depicted refined gatherings, where people reclined on couches, served by attendants, entertained by musicians. The dress was elegant, the postures dignified. Women attended these banquets openly, something shocking to Greeks and early Romans, but the paintings suggested social events, not moral decay. The equality between husband and wife shown in the sarcophagi, the tender way couples were depicted reclining together, spoke to a culture that valued partnership, not one dissolving into chaos. The archaeological evidence contradicted the Roman characterization of Etruscan weakness. The city walls were massive, built of carefully fitted stone blocks without mortar, some still standing after 2,500 years. The weapons found in tombs were high-quality bronze, well-made, practical. The armor rivaled anything in the Mediterranean. These were not the possessions of a weak, decadent people. These were the tools of warriors, the defenses of a civilization that knew it needed to protect itself. The engineering especially challenged Roman claims. When archaeologists studied Etruscan cities, they found sophisticated water management that predated Roman engineering by centuries. The Etruscans drained marshes, built underground aqueducts, created sewer systems. The Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer of Rome, was an Etruscan project built when Rome was still ruled by Etruscan kings. The arch, that quintessential Roman invention, appeared in Etruscan gateways and tombs before Rome used it. The Romans did not invent these techniques. They learned them, perfected them, and then forgot to credit their teachers. So why did Roman writers denigrate the Etruscans? The answer lies in the nature of historical writing itself. History is written by victors, and victors must justify their victories. Rome conquered Etruria, absorbed its cities, suppressed its language, erased its independence. To justify this, Roman historians needed to portray Etruscans as inferior, as people who needed Roman civilization, even as they admitted Rome borrowed that civilization from Etruscans in the first place. The contradiction was built into the narrative. The legend of Rome's founding contained the contradiction in microcosm. Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders, were said to be descendants of Aeneas, a Trojan hero, but the she-wolf who nursed them was an Etruscan symbol. The augury Romulus performed to determine where to build the city was Etruscan practice. The very act of founding Rome, the religious and technical procedures, came from Etruscan tradition. Rome was an Etruscan creation that rebelled against its creators and then rewrote the story to minimize the debt. The Roman kings themselves revealed the truth. After the legendary Romulus came Numa Pompilius, who established Rome's religious calendar and rituals, all borrowed from Etruscan practice. Then came three explicitly Etruscan kings: Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus. These kings built the first great monuments of Rome, established its government structure, expanded its territory. The expulsion of the last Tarquin and the founding of the Republic was, in essence, a Roman rebellion against Etruscan rule. And yet, for centuries after the Republic's founding, Etruscan culture dominated Roman life. The Roman upper classes hired Etruscan tutors to educate their children. Roman priests consulted Etruscan haruspices to interpret omens. Roman architects employed Etruscan techniques. Roman artists imitated Etruscan styles. The contradiction was stark. Romans rejected Etruscan political authority while embracing Etruscan cultural authority. The status of Etruscan women particularly troubled Roman historians and became a focus of their criticism. The tomb art showed women at banquets, women owning property, women's names appearing in inscriptions, maternal lineage sometimes emphasized alongside paternal. To Romans, this suggested moral looseness, a breakdown of proper patriarchal order. To modern archaeologists, it suggested a different social structure, one where women held legal and social rights that would not reappear in Italy until modern times. The religious practices also drew Roman criticism, wrapped in grudging respect. Etruscan priests claimed they could read the will of the gods by examining the livers of sacrificed animals, by interpreting lightning strikes, by observing bird flight. Romans called this superstition, while simultaneously hiring Etruscan priests to perform these same divinations for Roman state purposes. The contradiction went unexamined. The practices were simultaneously dismissed as irrational and treated as essential for knowing divine will. Perhaps the deepest contradiction lay in language. Romans spoke Latin an assignedly dismissed, Italic language that spread with Roman conquest until it became the language of empire. But Latin itself contained Etruscan loanwords. Roman names were often Etruscan in origin. Roman religious vocabulary was thick with Etruscan terms. The language Rome supposedly imposed on Etruria was already half Etruscan before the conquest began. The conqueror spoke the conquered's language and claimed it as their own. By the 19th century, scholars examining these contradictions realized that Roman accounts of the Etruscans could not be taken at face value. They were propaganda, justification, the victor's narrative. But this left a problem. If Roman sources were unreliable, what sources remained? The Etruscan language was only partially understood. No Etruscan histories survived. No Etruscan literature, no Etruscan philosophy, no Etruscan accounts of their own lives and beliefs. Everything came filtered through Roman or Greek observers, all of whom brought their own biases and agendas. The tombs offered a counter-narrative, but tombs show how people wish to be remembered, not necessarily how they lived. The frescoes were idealized, the grave goods selected for symbolic purposes, the whole presentation a performance for eternity. To read the tombs as documentary evidence required careful interpretation, understanding artistic conventions, recognizing symbolic versus literal representations. The archaeologists were learning to read these silent testimonies, but the reading was difficult, ambiguous, always open to multiple interpretations. The contradiction between legend and reality was not just an academic problem. How do you reconstruct a civilization when every written source is hostile or dismissive, when the only other evidence is material culture that cannot speak for itself, when the very language of the people is locked away in inscriptions no one can fully read? The Etruscans had become a mirror in which scholars saw their own assumptions reflected back. Were they Eastern migrants or indigenous Italians? Were they matriarchal or simply less patriarchal than Rome? Were they decadent or sophisticated? The evidence supported many interpretations, and the interpreter's bias determined which seemed most convincing. What remained certain was that the Roman narrative was incomplete at best, deliberately misleading at worst. The Etruscans were not weak barbarians civilized by Rome. They were a sophisticated civilization that profoundly shaped Rome, that taught Rome much of what made Rome great, and that was then conquered, absorbed, and written out of history by its former student. The legend said one thing. The reality, slowly emerging from tombs and ruins, said another. Reconciling the two would require more than archaeology. It would require honesty about how history is written and who gets to tell it. The question of Etruscan origins became the great debate of 19th century archaeology, a scholarly battle that divided experts into camps as entrenched as warring city-states. Each side marshalled evidence, attacked opposing theories, and defended its position with the fervour of religious conviction. The stakes seemed abstract, a question about ancient migration patterns, but beneath the surface lay deeper questions about identity, cultural development, and the nature of civilization itself. The Eastern origin theory rested primarily on Herodotus, the Greek historian writing in the 5th century before Christ. He claimed the Etruscans, or Tyrrhenians as Greeks called them, came from Lydia in western Anatolia. According to his account, a famine struck Lydia during the reign of King Attis. The people endured for years, inventing games to distract themselves from hunger, dice and knucklebones and other diversions. Finally, when the famine would not end, King Attis divided his people in half. One group stayed in Lydia under his rule. The other, led by his son Tyrannus, sailed west to find new lands, eventually settling in Italy. Supporters of this theory pointed to several pieces of evidence. First, the Etruscan language appeared unrelated to other Italian languages, but might have Eastern connections. Some linguists claim to see similarities between Etruscan and Lemnian, a language known from inscriptions on the Greek island of Lemnos, suggesting a shared origin somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean. Second, certain Etruscan religious practices, especially divination through examining animal livers, had parallels in Mesopotamia and Anatolia. Third, some Etruscan art showed Eastern influences, motifs and styles that seemed imported rather than developed locally. The indigenous theory, championed by followers of Dionysius of Halicarnassus, rejected migration entirely. Dionysius, writing in the 1st century before Christ, argued that Herodotus was wrong, that the Etruscans were native Italians who developed their culture in place. This theory emphasized continuity. Archaeological evidence showed continuous settlement in Tuscany from the Bronze Age through the Iron Age into the historical Etruscan period. The culture evolved gradually, without evidence of sudden population replacement or mass migration. The Etruscans were simply Italians, always had been, their sophistication emerging from local development rather than imported from elsewhere. This group had its own evidence. The Etruscan cities occupied sites with long histories of habitation. Burial practices showed evolution rather than sudden change. The pottery styles developed incrementally from earlier local traditions. Most importantly, the theory explained why the Etruscans seemed so adapted to their environment. Their engineering tackled specifically Italian problems, draining marshes, managing rivers, building on volcanic tufa. Their agriculture suited local conditions. Their trade networks connected Italian geography. Everything suggested deep local knowledge, generations of learning, not recent arrivals, adapting to unfamiliar terrain. A third theory emerged, attempting compromise. Perhaps small groups of Eastern traders or colonists arrived in Italy and intermarried with local populations, bringing new ideas but not replacing existing people. This cultural diffusion model became popular among scholars, uncomfortable with the stark either-or of the main theories. It allowed for both indigenous development and Eastern influence, explaining the contradictions by making them complementary rather than oppositional. The Etruscans could be native Italians who adopted and adapted Eastern innovations, creating something new from both sources. The debates raged in academic journals and scholarly conferences throughout the 1800s. Evidence that seemed definitive to one side appeared irrelevant to the other. The discovery of inscriptions in Lemnian that resembled Etruscan sparked excitement among Eastern origin theorists. But indigenous theorists argued this proved only that Etruscans had traded or colonized the Eastern Mediterranean, not that they originated there. The flow could have gone either direction. Linguistic analysis provided no clear answers. Etruscan remained stubbornly isolated, clearly not Indo-European like Latin and Greek, but not definitively connected to any other known language family either. Some scholars claimed they could trace Etruscan words to Anatolian roots. Others insisted such connections were superficial, coincidental similarities that proved nothing. The language stood alone, which could support either theory. Either the Etruscans brought a unique language from the East, or they preserved an indigenous pre-Indo-European language that disappeared everywhere else. The art evidence proved equally ambiguous. Yes, some Etruscan artistic motifs resembled Eastern styles, but the Mediterranean was connected by trade. Styles travelled on merchant ships. Greek pottery appeared in Etruscan tombs, but no one claimed the Etruscans were Greeks. Phoenician scarabs appeared in Etruscan jewellery, but no one claimed they were Phoenicians. Trade explained Eastern influences without requiring migration. The opposing side countered that the influences went deeper than trade, that fundamental religious and cultural practices showed Eastern roots, but this too could not be definitively proven. The mythology offered no clarity. Etruscan religious texts and artistic representations showed gods that Romans later identified with their own pantheon. Tinia was Jupiter, Uni was Juno, Menrava was Minerva. But were these originally Eastern gods or indigenous Italian deities given Greek-sounding names by Roman interpreters? The mythological scenes painted in tombs drew from Greek mythology, but Greeks had colonized southern Italy, and cultural exchange was constant. Mythology proved only that the ancient Mediterranean was interconnected, not where anyone originated. Physical anthropology entered the debate in the late 19th century. Scientists began measuring skulls from Etruscan tombs, comparing bone structure to various Mediterranean populations, searching for evidence of migration or indigenous development. The results were inconclusive, contradictory, and often coloured by the racial theories of the time. Some studies claimed Eastern characteristics, others found Italian features. The methodology itself was questionable, and modern science has abandoned these approaches, but at the time, they seem to offer objective evidence. The Roman historian Livy had offered yet another theory, suggesting the Etruscans came from the north, that they were related to the Rhaetians, an Alpine people. This theory never gained much support, but it added to the confusion, giving scholars three ancient sources offering three different origins. How could historians thousands of years later determine the truth when ancient writers who lived much closer to the events disagreed? Perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the debate was how it overshadowed other questions. Scholars spent so much energy arguing about origins that they paid less attention to what the Etruscans actually did, how they lived, what their society was like. The question of where they came from seemed more important than the question of who they became. The mystery of their arrival overshadowed the mystery of their disappearance. By the early 20th century, the debate had reached a stalemate. Both theories had evidence, both had problems, neither could definitively prove its case. The Etruscans remained enigmatic, their origins uncertain, their development contested. Some scholars grew frustrated with the entire question, arguing it was unanswerable with available evidence, that perhaps it was even the wrong question to ask. What did it matter where they came from? What mattered was what they created, the civilization they built, the influence they had. But the question would not die. Each new discovery was immediately pressed into service supporting one theory or another. Each new analytical technique was applied to Etruscan remains, hoping for definitive answers. The debate became a defining feature of Etruscan studies, the question that every scholar had to address, the mystery that seemed more important than all the things that were actually known. The Etruscans had become a puzzle, and the puzzle obsessed everyone who encountered it. The theories multiplied, divided, recombined. Perhaps the Etruscans were Anatolian migrants who arrived in the Bronze Age. Perhaps they were indigenous Villanovans who adopted Eastern culture. Perhaps they were a mixture of multiple populations, coalescing into a new identity. Perhaps the question of origins was itself flawed, assuming ancient peoples had single sources when reality was always more complex. The debate generated more heat than light, more arguments than answers, more speculation than certainty. What remained clear was that the Etruscans were a major civilization, sophisticated and influential, regardless of their origins. Where they came from was less important than what they accomplished, but the mystery of their arrival continued to fascinate, continued to generate theories, continued to divide scholars into opposing camps. The enigma of Etruscan origins became inseparable from the Etruscan enigma itself, a mystery within a mystery, a question that might never be answered but would never stop being asked. The systematic archaeological investigation of Etruria began in earnest in the mid-19th century, when excavation evolved from treasure hunting into something resembling science. The change came gradually, driven by scholars who realized that context mattered as much as objects, that how things were found revealed as much as what was found. The tombs of Tuscany and Lazio became laboratories where new methods were tested and refined. The challenge was immense. Etruscan cemeteries, called necropoli, sprawled across hillsides in vast fields of the dead. Tarquinia alone contained thousands of tombs, many still sealed, many robbed in antiquity, some discovered and lost again over centuries. Each tomb was a time capsule, but opening it destroyed something irreplaceable. Once exposed to air, once disturbed, the tomb could never be pristine again. The archaeologists learned to work carefully, to document everything before moving anything, to treat each excavation as a one-time opportunity that required meticulous attention. The Tomb of the Bulls, discovered near Tarquinia in 1892, demonstrated both the potential and the problems. When archaeologists cleared the entrance and descended into the burial chamber, they found walls covered with some of the earliest Etruscan frescoes known. The paintings dated to roughly 540 before Christ, showing scenes from Greek mythology, the ambush of Troilus by Achilles, erotic imagery, symbolic animals. The colours were still vivid, the details sharp. But within years of exposure, the frescoes began to fade. Humidity, temperature changes, even the breath of visitors damaged what had survived 2.5 millennia, sealed in darkness. This pattern repeated across Etruria. The Tomb of the Leopards, found in 1875, showed a banquet scene so beautiful it became the iconic image of Etruscan life. Couples reclined on couches, servants brought wine, musicians played double flutes and lyres. But the tomb's exposure began its deterioration. Archaeologists raced to document, to draw, to photograph before the paintings dimmed. Later, excavations learned to limit access, to control environment, but the early discoveries suffered from their own fame. The investigation expanded beyond tombs. Archaeologists began excavating Etruscan cities themselves, not just their cemeteries. This proved more difficult. Cities were occupied continuously, built over and over by successive generations. Roman settlements covered Etruscan foundations. Medieval walls incorporated Etruscan stones. Modern towns sat atop ancient streets. Uncovering the Etruscan layer required careful stratigraphic excavation, peeling back centuries to reach the original settlement. At Veii, just north of Rome, excavations in the early 1900s revealed an enormous Etruscan city that once rivaled Rome itself. The city walls stretched for 11 kilometers, enclosing an area larger than early Rome. Archaeologists found temples, houses, workshops, and most famously, the sanctuary of Portinaccio, with its spectacular terracotta sculptures. The Apollo of Veii, a striding figure with an archaic smile, became one of the most celebrated examples of Etruscan art, showing sophistication equal to contemporary Greek work. The excavations also revealed Etruscan engineering prowess. At Veii, archaeologists discovered the cuniculi, underground drainage tunnels that carried water away from the city. These tunnels were carefully engineered, cut through solid rock, some stretching for kilometers. Similar systems appeared at other Etruscan sites. The Romans would later claim credit for this technology, but the Etruscans had mastered it centuries earlier. Translation efforts paralleled archaeological work. Scholars accumulated Etruscan inscriptions, cataloguing them, comparing them, searching for patterns. The corpus grew slowly. Most inscriptions were short, funerary texts giving names and ages, dedications to gods, boundary markers. Longer texts were rare. The most important, the Liber Linteus, was written on linen strips, later used to wrap an Egyptian mummy, now in Zagreb. It contained religious calendar information. But even this longest surviving Etruscan text remained largely mysterious. The breakthrough came through bilingual inscriptions, though never as dramatically as the Rosetta Stone had unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphics. The Piaget tablets, discovered in 1964 at the port of Caere, contained text in both Etruscan and Phoenician. The translation was not exact, but it provided enough correlation to confirm meanings of several Etruscan words and grammatical structures. Similar finds, inscriptions with both Etruscan and Latin, helped scholars build a limited vocabulary, but full grammatical understanding remained elusive. Linguists established certain facts. Etruscan was written right to left. It was agglutinative, building complex words from roots and suffixes. It marks gender and case. It had no descendants, no living language preserved its structure. The alphabet was borrowed from Greek, but adapted to represent sounds specific to Etruscan. Some letters had different values than in Greek. The spelling was not always consistent, varying by region and period. Reading the words was possible. Understanding sentences was harder. Grasping nuance was often impossible. The investigation took unexpected turns. In 1968, archaeologists discovered a set of gold tablets at Pyrgi that revolutionized understanding of Etruscan religion. The tablets recorded a dedication by King Thefari Velianus of Caere to the goddess Uni, equivalent to the Phoenician Astarte. The bilingual nature of the text confirmed religious connections between Etruscans and other Mediterranean peoples. More importantly, it showed that Etruscan kings dedicated offerings in multiple languages, suggesting a cosmopolitan culture comfortable with foreign trade and cultural exchange. DNA analysis entered the investigation in the late 20th century, offering new tools to address the origin question. Scientists extracted DNA from Etruscan skeletal remains and compared it to modern populations. The results were complex and often contradictory. Some studies suggested genetic connections to Anatolia, supporting Herodotus. Others found no significant difference from other ancient Italian populations, supporting indigenous development. The science was new, the samples limited, the interpretations contested. DNA offered clues, but not conclusions. Computer analysis of inscriptions began in the 1980s, using algorithms to identify patterns humans might miss. Scholars built databases of every known Etruscan word, cross-referenced contexts, tracked usage patterns. This statistical approach confirmed some interpretations and challenged others. It revealed that certain words appeared primarily in funerary contexts, others in religious dedications, helping scholars refine their understanding of specialized vocabulary. But the fundamental limitation remained. Without extensive texts, without literature or historical records, the language could be only partially recovered. The investigation also encompassed Etruscan influence on Rome. Scholars traced architectural features, religious practices, social customs, and governmental structures from Etruscan into Roman culture. The Roman toga derived from Etruscan dress. The Roman triumph ceremony came from Etruscan ritual. The Roman practice of consulting augurs descended from Etruscan divination. Even the layout of Roman camps, with two main streets crossing at right angles, followed Etruscan urban planning principles. Rome was, in many ways, an Etruscan creation that outlived and overshadowed its creators. By the late 20th century, the investigation had produced a vast corpus of knowledge. Thousands of tombs had been excavated and documented. Museums held tens of thousands of Etruscan artifacts. The inscriptions had been catalogued and partially translated. The cities had been mapped and partially uncovered. DNA studies were underway. Computer databases organized information for analysis, yet fundamental questions remained unanswered. The Etruscans were better understood than a century before, but they remained enigmatic, their language incompletely known, their origins debated, their ultimate fate a mystery of assimilation and disappearance. The investigation continues. New tombs are still discovered. New analytical techniques offer new perspectives. Each generation of scholars approaches the evidence with fresh questions and refined methods. The Etruscans reveal themselves slowly, incrementally, never completely. Every answer generates new questions. Every discovery adds complexity to what was already complex. The truth emerges piece by piece, a mosaic assembled from fragments, beautiful but incomplete, compelling but mysterious, a civilization reconstructed from what it left behind. Stand in the Museo Nazionale Etrusco in Rome, in the Villa Giulia, and you stand surrounded by evidence of a lost world. Room after room holds artifacts excavated from Etruscan tombs and cities, each object a fragment of a civilization that vanished 2,000 years ago. The evidence is tangible, material, real. You can see it, measure it, analyze it. Yet it speaks in a language only partially understood, answers some questions while raising others, illuminates and obscures in equal measure. The sarcophagus of the spouses dominates one gallery, a terracotta masterpiece from Cerveteri dating to 520 before Christ. A married couple reclines together on a funeral couch, the husband's arm around his wife's shoulders, both with serene expressions and archaic smiles. Their gestures suggest they once held objects, perhaps cups for a symbolic eternal banquet. The workmanship is extraordinary, each fold of their clothing carefully rendered, their features individualized rather than generic. This is not anonymous art. These are portraits of real people, preserved in clay. What does this sarcophagus tell us? That Etruscans depicted married couples together in death, suggesting a view of marriage as partnership continuing beyond life. That Etruscan sculptors could work at the highest level of Mediterranean art. That funerary practices emphasize continuity and celebration rather than grief and finality. That women held positions of honor and respect, sufficient to be depicted as equals in the most important monuments. But the sarcophagus also raises questions. Were all marriages depicted this way, or only elite ones? Does this represent reality or idealization? Were these specific people or generic types? The evidence reveals and conceals simultaneously. Move to the bronze collection. The Chimera of Arezzo, discovered in 1533, is one of the most famous Etruscan artworks. A bronze lion with a goat's head rising from its back and a serpent for a tail, it represents the mythological Chimera killed by Bellerophon. The craftsmanship is superb, the anatomy accurate, the surface worked with fine detail. An inscription on the foreleg reads, "This is a votive offering to the god Tinia." Here is concrete evidence of Etruscan religious practice, of bronze-working skill, of mythological knowledge shared with Greeks. Yet we do not know which temple it came from, what specific ritual it commemorated, or why the monster was chosen as a votive offering. The tomb of the leopards at Tarquinia provides evidence of a different kind. The frescoes, painted around 470 before Christ, show a banquet scene on the rear wall. 3 couches hold reclining diners, couples paired together, while servants bring food and wine. Musicians play instruments, a double flute and a lyre. The colours are earth tones, reds and browns and ochres, still vibrant after 2.5 millennia. Above, leopards give the tomb its name, though they are decorative rather than narrative elements. This evidence tells us how Etruscans wanted to remember their dead, surrounded by scenes of joy and celebration. The style of painting, the poses of the figures, the details of clothing and furniture, all provide information about Etruscan artistic conventions and possibly daily life. The presence of music and wine suggests banquets were important social occasions. The pairing of couples reinforces what the sarcophagi show, that husband and wife attended social events together. But again, questions multiply. Is this documentary evidence or symbolic representation? Did actual banquets resemble these paintings? Or is this an idealized afterlife vision? Were these specific people's actual lives, or generic scenes, appropriate for any tomb? The gold jewellery from the Regolini Galassi tomb demonstrates technical mastery that challenges modern goldsmiths. A gold fibula, a large safety pin used to fasten clothing, is decorated with granulations so fine that individual gold grains are barely visible. The technique involves fusing tiny spheres of gold onto a gold surface without melting either, requiring precise temperature control and masterful skill. The Etruscans achieved this in the 7th century before Christ, creating jewellery that looks almost impossibly delicate. This evidence proves Etruscan metallurgical sophistication beyond question. It demonstrates wealth sufficient to create purely decorative objects of extraordinary value. It shows trade connections, since the designs include Near Eastern motifs. But we do not know who made it, who wore it, or what specific significance it held beyond beauty and status. The Pyrgi tablets, discovered in 1964, provide the most important linguistic evidence. 3 gold sheets, 2 with Etruscan text and 1 with Phoenician, record the dedication of a temple by King Veii Velianus of Caere to the goddess Uni. The Phoenician version is longer but covers similar content, providing a partial bilingual text. This evidence confirmed that Uni was equivalent to Phoenician Astarte and Roman Juno. It showed that Etruscan kings made dedications in multiple languages, suggesting international diplomacy and trade. It provided grammatical clues by allowing scholars to compare Etruscan and Phoenician sentence structures. Yet even this best evidence for translation leaves most Etruscan texts mysterious, since religious dedication formulas do not unlock everyday vocabulary or complex grammar. The city of Veii itself provides evidence of urban planning and engineering. The walls, built of tufa blocks fitted without mortar, enclosed a city of over 180 hectares. Inside, excavations revealed houses arranged along streets, temples positioned at high points, workshops for pottery and metalworking, and most impressively, the cuniculi drainage system. These underground tunnels channeled water away from the city, preventing flooding and managing sewage. The engineering required understanding of hydrology, skill in rock cutting, and coordinated labour. This evidence proves Etruscan cities were sophisticated urban centres with infrastructure rivaling any in the Mediterranean. Yet we do not know how they were governed, how decisions were made, how labour was organised, or what daily life was actually like for common people rather than the elite whose tombs provide most evidence. The Etruscan alphabet, preserved in thousands of inscriptions, provides evidence of literacy widespread enough to appear on pottery, boundary stones, mirrors, and personal objects. The letters are clearly derived from Greek, but adapted to Etruscan phonology. Reading them is straightforward. Most inscriptions follow predictable formulas. I am the cup of so-and-so. This tomb belongs to such and such, dedicated to this god by this person. These formulaic texts confirm vocabulary, but do not provide the complex sentences needed to understand grammar fully. The longest text, the Liber Linteus, contains religious calendar information, but remains partially mysterious despite decades of study. The evidence of Etruscan influence on Rome is perhaps the most extensive and least ambiguous. Roman architecture used the Etruscan arch and vault. Roman temples followed Etruscan design principles. Roman religion incorporated Etruscan divination practices wholesale, with Roman priests explicitly trained by Etruscan haruspices. Roman naming conventions, with praenomen, nomen, and cognomen, derived from Etruscan practice. Even specific Latin words have Etruscan origins. Persona, meaning mask or person, comes from Etruscan fursu. The evidence of influence is overwhelming and undeniable, yet this same influence makes it harder to distinguish what was originally Etruscan versus what was later Roman, since the two cultures merged gradually over centuries. The tombs themselves, hundreds excavated, thousands more known but unexcavated, constitute vast evidence fields. The variety of tomb types shows cultural evolution, simple pit graves giving way to chamber tombs, stone chambers replaced by painted chambers, individual burials becoming family mausoleums. The grave goods trace trade networks and cultural connections. Greek pottery from Athens and Corinth, Phoenician glass, Egyptian scarabs, Celtic amber, Iberian metals. The wealth displayed in elite tombs contrasts with simpler burials, suggesting social stratification. Yet the consistent practice of elaborate burial across centuries shows continuity of belief in an afterlife, requiring material provisions. All this evidence, accumulated over 2 centuries of discovery and study, has reconstructed much of Etruscan civilization. We know what they made, how they built, what they valued enough to bury with their dead. We can trace their trade networks, date their artistic periods, map their cities, read their names, yet fundamental aspects remain mysterious. We cannot read most of their written records. We do not know their literature, their philosophy, their own accounts of their history. We see them through Roman eyes, through tomb art, through material culture, but we do not hear their voices clearly. The evidence is abundant but incomplete, revealing and frustrating, showing us fragments of a lost world, but never the whole picture. Beneath the surface, questions of origin and language lay deeper mysteries that archaeologists only gradually recognized. The Etruscans were not simply another ancient Mediterranean culture. They were different in ways that challenged assumptions about how ancient societies were supposed to work. The more evidence that accumulated, the more these differences stood out, suggesting a civilization that organized itself according to principles unlike those of its neighbors. The status of women was the first shocking revelation. The Greek historian Theopompus, writing in the 4th century before Christ, described Etruscan women with scandalized disapproval. They exercised with men, attended banquets reclining beside their husbands, drank wine freely, and were called by their own names rather than their husbands'. To a Greek, this was evidence of moral corruption. To modern scholars examining the evidence more carefully, it suggested something far more interesting: a society where women held legal and social rights unknown elsewhere in the ancient Mediterranean. The tomb art consistently showed this. The sarcophagus of the spouses depicted husband and wife as equals, reclining together, their gestures suggesting conversation and partnership. The tomb of the leopards showed women at banquets, not serving but participating. Inscriptions gave women's names, and sometimes maternal lineage, unusual in a world where women were usually identified only through fathers or husbands. Some tombs bore inscriptions listing the deceased woman's accomplishments and titles, suggesting women could hold positions of authority. Legal evidence, fragmentary but suggestive, indicated women could own property independently. Marriage contracts mentioned women's assets separately from their husbands. Some tomb inscriptions suggested women could inherit and bequeath wealth. This was not the Roman system, where women remained legal minors under male guardianship. This was something different, a social structure that granted women autonomy and legal standing. The evidence was not extensive enough to reconstruct the complete legal system, but what existed suggested a society organized along more egalitarian lines than its contemporaries. The religious system revealed another profound difference. Etruscan religion was not centered on temples and public ceremonies in the Greek or Roman manner. It was fundamentally about divination, about reading the will of gods in natural phenomena. Lightning was not just Zeus throwing thunderbolts. It was a complex language where the direction, type, and timing of lightning conveyed specific divine messages. Different gods sent lightning from different sectors of the sky. The patterns meant different things at different times. The system was sophisticated enough to require extensive training and detailed manuals. The haruspices, Etruscan priests who practiced divination, became famous throughout the Mediterranean. They examined the livers of sacrificed animals, reading divine will in the organ's shape, colour, and markings. The practice sounds bizarre to modern ears, but it rested on a coherent theology. The liver was considered the seat of life and emotion, the organ most connected to divine influence. By studying it carefully, trained priests could interpret what gods wanted or predicted. The Piacenza liver, a bronze model marked with divine regions, showed how systematic this practice was. It was not random superstition. It was a structured, interpretive system. Romans adopted these practices wholesale, but never seemed to fully understand their theological underpinnings. Roman haruspices were often Etruscan or trained by Etruscans. The sacred texts that explain the system, the Libri Haruspicini, were written in Etruscan. Romans consulted haruspices regularly for state decisions, but treated the practice as a tool rather than a complete religious worldview. The mystery was not just the techniques, but the belief system that made them coherent and meaningful. The Etruscan conception of the afterlife differed markedly from Greek and Roman ideas. The tomb frescoes did not show the grim underworld of Greek mythology or the vague Roman concept of shades wandering in darkness. They showed celebration, banqueting, music, dancing, athletic games. The dead were depicted as active participants in joyful activities, not as diminished spirits in a shadowy realm. This suggested a religion that viewed death not as a terrible ending, but as a transition to another form of existence where pleasure and beauty continued. Yet darker elements existed alongside this optimism. Some later tombs, particularly from the Hellenistic period, showed demons and frightening figures, suggesting beliefs about judgment and punishment developed over time. The demon Cherun appeared with a hammer, the demon Vanth with wings and a torch. These figures guarded transitions, enforced divine will, possibly punished the unworthy. The religion was more complex than the earlier celebratory frescoes suggested, containing both hope for continued joy and fear of divine judgment. The political organization revealed another mystery. The 12 Etruscan cities were independent states that cooperated through a religious league. They gathered annually at the sanctuary of Voltumna to conduct joint religious ceremonies and discuss common concerns, but they rarely coordinated military action effectively. When Rome attacked Veii in 406 before Christ, the other Etruscan cities provided minimal support. Veii fell after a 10-year siege, while its supposed allies watched. This pattern repeated as Rome conquered Etruria city by city. Why did the Etruscan cities fail to unite against Rome? Some scholars suggested political rivalry prevented cooperation. Others argued religious sanctions limited warfare between league members, but did not compel mutual defense. Still others proposed that each city's independence was so valued that collective action was nearly impossible. The mystery deepened because this failure to unite directly caused Etruscan civilization's disappearance. Had they coordinated defense, they might have stopped Rome. Instead, they fell separately, absorbed one by one into the expanding Roman state. The language itself contained mysteries beyond mere translation difficulty. Etruscan seemed to be a language isolate, unrelated to anything else. Yet it persisted alongside Greek and Latin for centuries, without being displaced until Roman conquest forced assimilation. How did it remain so distinct? Most language isolates disappear through contact and mixture. Etruscan resisted this process, remaining pure and separate until political power shifted and speakers had no choice but to adopt Latin. The linguistic isolation mirrored cultural distinctiveness, suggesting the Etruscans actively maintained their difference. The art revealed yet another mystery. Etruscan artists clearly knew Greek art, traded with Greek cities, borrowed Greek mythological themes. Yet their style remained distinctive, more expressive, more focused on movement and emotion, less concerned with ideal proportions. The archaic smile on Etruscan sculptures was not identical to the Greek archaic smile. Etruscan figures had a different quality, more immediate, less remote. This artistic independence suggested confidence, a culture secure enough in its own aesthetic that it could borrow without being dominated. Perhaps the deepest mystery was what the Romans tried to erase. We know Rome suppressed Etruscan language, absorbed Etruscan cities, and discouraged Etruscan identity. But we do not know why this was necessary. If the Etruscans were simply another conquered people, why suppress them so thoroughly? If they were primitive barbarians, as Roman propaganda claimed, why adopt so many of their practices? The completeness of their erasure suggests they represented something Rome found threatening, not just politically but culturally or ideologically. What that was remains mysterious. The Etruscans practiced a culture that elevated women, made divination central to religious practice, celebrated life in death, maintained fierce independence, created distinctive art, and spoke an isolated language. Each of these facts is strange enough. Taken together, they paint a picture of a civilization that was genuinely different, not just another variation of Mediterranean norms. And difference itself might have been the deepest mystery, the reason Rome worked so hard to erase them. They were too different to be absorbed comfortably, too influential to be ignored, too distinctive to be allowed to continue existing independently. So they were conquered, assimilated, and written out of history, leaving behind mysteries in tombs and questions in an untranslatable language. The year was 406 before Christ. Rome, still a relatively small power, declared war on Veii, the closest and wealthiest Etruscan city. The war would last 10 years, longer than the Trojan War of legend, and its conclusion would mark the moment when the balance of power in central Italy shifted irreversibly from Etruscan to Roman. Veii sat on a plateau just 16 kilometers north of Rome, protected by steep cliffs on 3 sides and massive walls on the 4th. The city controlled a vast territory, rich agricultural land, and important salt trade routes from the Tyrrhenian coast. Its wealth was legendary. Its temples were adorned with terracotta sculptures of extraordinary quality, including the famous Apollo that would later be taken to Rome. Its houses were spacious and well built. Its fortifications seemed impregnable. To Rome, expanding northward and seeking to control more territory, Veii represented both an opportunity and an obstacle. The war began with typical ancient siege warfare. Roman armies appeared outside Veii's walls, devastated the surrounding countryside, burned crops, cut down orchards, tried to starve the city into submission. Veii's defenders watched from the walls, secure in their fortifications, supplied by underground passages that let them bring in food despite the siege. The Romans attacked repeatedly. Each time Veii's defences held, the siege settled into stalemate. Years passed. 405, 404, 403. Roman soldiers grew weary of repeated campaigns that accomplished nothing. The Roman treasury strained under the cost of maintaining an army in the field season after season. Political opposition grew in Rome, with some arguing the war was unwinnable, that Veii's walls were too strong, that the cost exceeded any possible gain. But the war continued, driven by stubborn Roman determination and the knowledge that failure would embolden every enemy watching. Veii's position seemed strong, but a fatal weakness undermined its defence. The other Etruscan cities provided almost no support. Caere, Tarquinia, Volsi, all the member cities of the Etruscan League, watched their ally face destruction and did nothing effective to help. Some sent token forces that arrived late or withdrew early. Some sent supplies, none committed to the desperate defence that might have broken the siege. The League met at the sanctuary of Voltumna, conducted its religious ceremonies, and failed to coordinate any meaningful military response. Why this paralysis? The sources do not explain clearly. Perhaps the cities were rivals as much as allies. each concerned primarily with its own interests. Perhaps religious prohibitions limited warfare between league members, but did not compel collective defense. Perhaps each city calculated that letting Veii fall would satisfy Rome's ambitions and preserve their own independence. If so, they miscalculated catastrophically. Veii's fall was not the end of Roman expansion, but its beginning. In 403, according to tradition, Marcus Furius Camillus became Roman dictator and assumed command of the siege. He brought new strategy and resources. Rather than continuing frontal assaults on impregnable walls, he ordered his engineers to dig a tunnel. The Romans would go under the walls rather than over them, emerging inside the city before defenders realized the threat. The work was grueling, dangerous, and slow, digging through volcanic tufa with ancient tools, supporting the tunnel to prevent collapse, maintaining secrecy so Veii's defenders would not discover and counter the plan. The tunnel reached under Veii's walls, then under the city streets, finally approaching the Temple of Juno on the citadel. The Romans chose this target deliberately. The temple represented Veii's spiritual heart, the seat of divine protection. By emerging there, the Romans would strike at both military and religious center simultaneously. The assault was timed for during religious ceremonies, when the temple would be occupied but defenses distracted. According to Roman legend, the priest of Juno was examining a sacrificial liver when Roman soldiers burst from the temple floor. The priest proclaimed that whoever completed the sacrifice would win victory. A Roman soldier seized the liver and completed the ritual, thus stealing Veii's divine protection and transferring it to Rome. The story was propaganda, designed to show Roman piety and divine favour. But beneath the legend lay a brutal truth. The Romans emerged inside the walls, opened the gates to their army outside, and Veii fell after 10 years of siege. The sack was merciless. Roman soldiers killed defenders, enslaved civilians, looted treasures. The Apollo of Veii was taken to Rome and installed in a Roman temple. Other sacred objects followed. The city's wealth, accumulated over centuries, was divided among Roman soldiers and the Roman treasury. Veii's population was dispersed, some killed, some enslaved, survivors scattered to other cities. The site itself was left largely deserted, its power broken, its threat eliminated. But the conquest was not merely military, it was ideological. Camillus is said to have invited Juno, Veii's patron goddess, to abandon her city and accept worship in Rome. This ritual, evocatio, was a Roman practice of religious warfare. By convincing enemy gods to switch sides, Romans believed they gained divine approval for conquest. Whether the ritual actually occurred or was later invention, the idea reveals Roman thinking. They did not just defeat Veii militarily. They absorbed its divine protection, its religious power, its spiritual legitimacy. The fall of Veii changed everything. Rome gained enormous territory, doubling its controlled land. It gained wealth to fund future campaigns. Most importantly, it gained psychological advantage. Veii had been the closest, richest, most powerful Etruscan city within reach. Its defeat proved Rome could conquer even the strongest Etruscan defences. The other Etruscan cities, which had failed to save Veii, now faced Rome's expansion alone, knowing cooperation had failed when it might have mattered. For the Etruscans, Veii's fall was a catastrophe, but not yet an existential crisis. 11 major cities remained, the League still existed, Etruscan culture still thrived, but the balance had shifted. Rome was no longer a neighbouring power to be watched warily. It was a conquering force that had demonstrated capability and will to destroy even the strongest opposition. The turning point had been reached. What followed would be decline, gradual but inexorable, as Rome expanded northward and the Etruscan cities fell one by one. The siege also changed Rome itself. 10 years of continuous warfare professionalized the Roman army. Paying soldiers for extended campaigns required new taxation systems and political structures. The experience taught Romans that persistence could overcome even the strongest defences, that systematic planning could succeed where heroic charges failed. The lessons learned at Veii would be applied at Carthage, at Corinth, at Jerusalem. Roman military success began here, at the walls of an Etruscan city that should have been saved by allies who never came. In 406 before Christ, Etruria was still a major power, wealthy and sophisticated, dominating central Italy as it had for centuries. By 396, when Veii finally fell, the future had changed. The siege marked the moment when Etruscan civilization began its long decline into history, when the culture that had built the foundations of Italian civilization started the slow process of disappearance that would leave it nearly forgotten until archaeologists rediscovered it 2,000 years later. The turning point had turned. Everything would be different now. The fall of Veii sent ripples across central Italy like a stone dropped in still water. The immediate consequences were military and territorial. Rome absorbed Veii's lands, distributed them to Roman citizens, and established new settlements in formerly Etruscan territory. The Roman frontier moved northward. The buffer zone between Roman and Etruscan territory disappeared. Where once Veii stood as a bulwark, now Roman farms and military colonies pushed closer to other Etruscan cities. The psychological impact ran deeper than territorial loss. For 4 centuries, the Etruscan cities had dominated central Italy, wealthy and confident in their superiority. They had taught the Romans architecture and engineering, religious practices and urban planning. Etruscan kings had ruled Rome itself. The relationship was one of older, more sophisticated culture, mentoring younger, cruder neighbours. Veii's fall inverted that relationship. The student had defeated the teacher. The mentored had conquered the mentor. The natural order seemed reversed. The other Etruscan cities faced a terrible question. Would they share Veii's fate? Some sought accommodation with Rome, negotiating treaties, accepting client status, hoping that cooperation would preserve their independence. Caere, which had maintained friendly relations with Rome, signed a treaty granting Romans trading rights and protection. The city calculated that alliance offered better survival prospects than resistance. For a time, this strategy worked. Caere prospered, its merchants benefited from Roman expansion, and the city maintained internal autonomy. Other cities chose defiance. Tarquinia, ancient and proud, refused Roman dominance. In 358 before Christ, Tarquinia led a coalition of Etruscan cities in war against Rome. The conflict lasted for years, a desperate attempt to restore the balance of power. Roman sources called it the Tarquinian War, describing fierce battles and heavy casualties on both sides. For a moment, it seemed resistance might succeed, that united Etruscan military power might check Roman expansion. But unity came too late and remained incomplete. Not all Etruscan cities joined the coalition. Some remained neutral, waiting to see which side would win. Others actively supported Rome, seeing more advantage in cooperation than resistance. The Etruscan League, which should have coordinated defence, proved incapable of enforcing collective action. Each city made its own calculations, pursued its own interests, and in doing so ensured that none would survive independently. The war ended in 351 with Tarquinia's defeat. The city was not destroyed like Veii, but it was forced to accept a treaty that severely limited its independence. Roman garrisons were stationed in Etruscan territory. Roman roads were built connecting Etruscan cities to Rome, facilitating military movement and economic integration. The treaty formalized what military defeat had established. Rome was now the dominant power in central Italy, and Etruscan independence existed only at Roman sufferance. The pattern repeated across Etruria over the next century. City after city either submitted peacefully or was conquered militarily. Volsi fell in 280, its population partly enslaved, its treasures looted. Volsinii resisted until 264, when Rome destroyed the city completely and rebuilt it at a new site, scattering the original population. Each conquest weakened the others. Each submission encouraged the next. The Etruscan cities, which might have stopped Rome if they had united early, fell separately because they had failed to recognize the existential threat until too late. Economic consequences accompanied military defeat. Roman control of territory meant Roman control of trade routes. Etruscan merchants who once dominated commerce in central Italy now competed with Roman traders backed by military power. The ports fell under Roman influence. The inland trade routes became Roman roads. The mining districts that had made Etruria wealthy were absorbed into Roman economic systems. Etruscan cities remained prosperous for a time, but their prosperity increasingly depended on Roman tolerance. The cultural consequences emerged gradually. As Roman power grew, Roman culture became prestigious. Latin, the language of the conquerors, became the language of power and advancement. Etruscan families wanting their children to succeed in this new order taught them Latin. Etruscan itself, once the dominant language of central Italy, began to retreat into private use, spoken at home and in religious ceremonies, but yielding to Latin in public life and official business. The religious changes cut deepest. Etruscan religion had shaped Roman religious practices, but now Roman power shaped which Etruscan practices survived. The haruspices continued, employed by Rome to interpret omens for Roman purposes, but the broader religious context, the sacred texts, and elaborate theological system began to fade. Roman priests learned the techniques without understanding the underlying worldview. Etruscan divination became a tool in Roman hands, divorced from its original cultural meaning. Yet resistance persisted in subtle forms. Etruscan families maintained their identity, spoke their language privately, preserved their traditions. Inscriptions continued to be written in Etruscan, even as Latin dominated public spaces. Tomb art continued to show traditional scenes even as Etruscan cities came under Roman control. The culture did not disappear overnight. It faded slowly, generation by generation, as political reality made assimilation advantageous and maintaining distinct identity increasingly difficult. The social consequences were profound. Etruscan aristocrats who accepted Roman authority could prosper, joining Roman social circles, intermarrying with Roman families, pursuing careers in Roman systems. Those who resisted faced marginalization or worse. The choice was stark: adapt or decline. Many chose adaptation, and in doing so, they preserved their families' positions but surrendered their cultural distinctiveness. Their children would speak Latin, their grandchildren might not know Etruscan at all, and their great-grandchildren would be simply Romans. The Etruscan ancestry, a fading memory. The military colonies Rome established in former Etruscan territory accelerated the transformation. Roman soldiers retired to land grants in Etruria, bringing Latin language and Roman customs. They married local women, creating mixed families where children might speak both languages, or increasingly only Latin. New towns grew up around Roman camps, built in Roman style, organized according to Roman urban planning. The physical landscape itself became Romanized. By 200 before Christ, less than 2 centuries after Veii's fall, the transformation was well advanced. Etruscan cities still existed, still bore their ancient names, still contained populations descended from Etruscan ancestors. But they were now Roman cities, governed by Roman law, speaking primarily Latin, integrated into Roman economic and political systems. The Etruscan League no longer met. The religious ceremonies at Voltumna had ceased. The independence that had defined Etruscan civilization for 5 centuries was gone. Yet something paradoxical occurred. As Etruscan political power disappeared, Etruscan cultural influence intensified. Roman architecture increasingly used Etruscan techniques. Roman religion relied heavily on Etruscan divination. Roman families claimed Etruscan ancestry as a mark of distinction. The conquered culture permeated the conqueror, influencing it from within even as it lost independence. Rome became, in many ways, the heir of Etruscan civilization, preserving and spreading Etruscan innovations even as it erased Etruscan identity. The consequence of Veii's fall was not a single event but a process, unfolding over generations, transforming the political map of Italy and the cultural landscape of the Mediterranean. The Etruscan cities fell or submitted. The Etruscan language retreated. The Etruscan identity became a memory, but the Etruscan legacy endured, woven into Roman civilization so thoroughly that Romans themselves often forgot its origin. The fall of Etruria enabled the rise of Rome, and Rome's rise carried Etruscan culture, transformed and unacknowledged, across the ancient world. Walk through Rome today, 2,000 years after Etruscan independence ended, and you walk through an Etruscan legacy disguised as Roman achievement. The arch that spans the street, that quintessentially Roman architectural feature, was an Etruscan invention. The sewer system beneath your feet, the Cloaca Maxima that still drains the Forum, was built by Etruscan engineers when Rome was ruled by Etruscan kings. The very layout of the city, the division of space, the placement of temples, followed Etruscan religious principles about sacred boundaries and divine geography. The Roman alphabet, which evolved into the letters you are reading now, derived from the Etruscan alphabet, which itself came from Greek, but the transmission path matters. Western Europe learned to write from Rome, and Rome learned from Etruria. The Etruscan intermediary shaped how letters were formed, which letters were used, how writing was organized. Every word written in English, French, Spanish, Italian, every language using Roman letters, carries this Etruscan inheritance. The Roman political system bore Etruscan influence in ways Romans themselves acknowledged. The fasces, the bundle of rods with an axe that symbolized Roman authority, was Etruscan in origin. Roman magistrates carried them because Etruscan lucimones had carried them centuries earlier. The toga, the distinctly Roman garment marking citizenship, derived from Etruscan dress. The triumph, the great victory procession where a conquering general paraded through Rome dressed as Jupiter, was an Etruscan religious ceremony adapted for Roman purposes. Roman religion was thoroughly permeated with Etruscan practice. The College of Augurs, who interpreted divine will through bird flight, learned their craft from Etruscan priests. The haruspices, who examined animal livers, were usually Etruscan or trained in Etruscan methods. The division of the sky into regions for interpreting lightning came directly from Etruscan theology. The practice of declaring some places sacred and forbidden, the concept of religious boundaries, the entire framework of Roman state religion rested on Etruscan foundations. The gods themselves travelled from Etruscan to Roman pantheons. Tinia became Jupiter, Uni became Juno, Minerva became Minerva. The transformations were not simple renaming. The gods carried attributes, mythologies, and worship practices with them. When Romans worshipped Jupiter, they used rituals and concepts that originated in Etruscan religion. The Roman religious calendar, with its festivals and sacred days, organized time according to patterns established by Etruscan priests, reading divine will in natural phenomena. Roman engineering, that practical mastery that built roads and aqueducts across an empire, learned its fundamental techniques from Etruscan builders. The true arch, the barrel vault, the use of the keystone, all appeared in Etruscan architecture before Rome adopted them. The drainage tunnels, the cuniculi that managed water flow, were Etruscan innovations. Romans perfected these techniques, built on a scale the Etruscans never attempted, but the foundation knowledge came from the conquered civilization. Urban planning followed Etruscan models. The Roman practice of laying out new cities on a grid, with two main streets crossing at right angles, dividing the space into 4 quarters, came from Etruscan religious concepts about sacred space. The Cardo and Decumanus, the north-south and east-west streets that organized Roman camps and cities, reflected Etruscan ideas about cosmic order manifested in urban design. Every Roman city, from Britain to Syria, every military camp from the Rhine to the Euphrates, embodied Etruscan spatial concepts. The gladiatorial games, that brutal entertainment that defined Roman spectacle, originated in Etruscan funeral rites. The Etruscans held athletic competitions and armed combat at funerals of important people, believing such displays honored the dead and provided entertainment in the afterlife. Romans transformed these funeral games into public spectacles, building amphitheatres and training professional fighters. But the origin lay in Etruscan practice. When crowds in the Colosseum watched gladiators fight, they witnessed an Etruscan ritual transformed into Roman entertainment. Roman names preserved Etruscan origins. The praenomen nomen cognomen system, the 3-part naming convention that became standard in Rome, was Etruscan. Common Roman names like Marcus, Gnaeus, Publius, and Aulus were Etruscan words whose original meanings were forgotten. Roman families claiming ancient lineage often traced their ancestry to Etruscan roots, though by imperial times, few remembered what that ancestry actually meant. The name lived on while the culture it came from faded into obscurity. The impact extended beyond Rome to the entire Mediterranean world. As Roman power spread, it carried Etruscan innovations with it. The arch appeared in Roman buildings from Gaul to Egypt. The engineering techniques drained marshes in Spain and Britain. The alphabet spread across Europe and eventually around the world. The religious concepts influenced early Christianity, which developed in a Roman Empire deeply shaped by Etruscan-derived practices. The urban planning organized cities on 3 continents. The legacy multiplied through Roman expansion, reaching far beyond what Etruscans themselves had ever controlled. Western civilization's foundations rest partly on Etruscan bedrock, though few recognize it. The Roman Empire, which shaped European history for centuries and influenced world history afterward, was built using knowledge, techniques, and cultural practices learned from Etruria. When Rome fell and Europe fragmented, Roman inheritance remained, and within that inheritance lay Etruscan elements. Medieval cathedrals used arches derived from Etruscan innovations. Renaissance artists studied Roman ruins that embodied Etruscan architectural principles. Modern democratic systems referenced Roman political concepts that had Etruscan origins. The alphabet you read, the arches in buildings around you, the engineering in water systems, the organization of cities, the structure of names, all carry traces of a civilization that vanished 2,000 years ago. The Etruscans disappeared as a people. Their language died, their cities were absorbed, their identity was erased. But their innovations, techniques, and ideas survived, transmitted through Rome, spread across the world, becoming so fundamental that they seem natural rather than invented, universal rather than cultural, eternal rather than historical. This is perhaps the strangest consequence of Etruscan disappearance. They achieved a kind of immortality through the culture that conquered them. Their name was forgotten by most people, their history unknown, their language unreadable. Yet their legacy shaped daily life for billions of people who never heard of them. The arch that holds up the bridge, the letters that spell the sign, the layout of the town, all whisper in Etruscan, a language lost but somehow still speaking through forms and structures that outlived the people who created them. The impact of Etruscan civilization on our world is both immense and invisible, profound and unacknowledged. We live in a world partly shaped by Etruscan innovation, partly organized according to Etruscan concepts, partly built using Etruscan techniques. But we do not know it, because history remembers Rome and forgets the teachers who made Rome possible. The Etruscans shaped our world and then vanished from the story, leaving behind treasures in tombs and influences in daily life, remembered by specialists and forgotten by everyone else, present, everywhere and recognized nowhere. Step into the tomb of the triclinium at Tarquinia, painted around 470 before Christ, and you step into a moment of celebration frozen in time. On the back wall, a banquet unfolds. 3 couches hold diners, reclining in the Mediterranean manner, couples paired together. Musicians play to the left, a man with a double flute and a boy with a lyre. To the right, dancers move with abandon, their gestures suggesting joy and movement. Above them all, trees frame the scene, suggesting an outdoor setting, nature embracing the gathering. These are not gods or heroes. These are people, possibly the specific people buried in this tomb, or at least representations of how they wanted to be remembered. Look closely at their faces. They are individualized, not generic. The painter gave them distinct features, different expressions, varying postures. These were real people once, breathing and laughing, holding cups of wine, listening to music, enjoying the fleeting pleasures of existence before death claimed them and consigned them to painted memory. The woman on the left couch reclines beside her husband, her posture relaxed and comfortable. She wears a pleated dress and pointed shoes. Her hair is elaborately arranged. She holds a drinking cup in one hand, gesturing with the other in what seems like conversation. In Greece, respectable women did not attend banquets with men. In Rome, women sat upright on chairs while men reclined. Here, in Etruria, this woman reclines as an equal, participating fully in the social gathering. Her presence is unremarkable, natural, suggesting a culture where such equality was normal rather than shocking. The musicians capture a moment of concentration, The flute player's cheeks bulge with the effort of producing sound. The boy with the lyre watches his hands, attending to his playing. These are not symbolic figures representing music in the abstract. These are performers doing their work, skilled craftspeople, providing entertainment, caught in a moment of artistic focus. Someone valued them enough to include them in this eternal scene, to memorialize not just the wealthy diners, but also those who made the gathering joyful. The dancers tell their own story. A young man leaps, his arms raised, his body contorted in mid-movement. His tunic swirls around him. A woman beside him mirrors his energy, her gestures expansive. They are not performing formal, ritualized steps. They are dancing with abandon, with joy, with the unself-conscious pleasure of bodies in motion. The painter captured energy and spontaneity, a moment of life lived fully, preserved because someone thought such moments were worth remembering forever. Outside the tombs, in the ruins of cities, and in the records that survive, other voices whisper. An inscription on a bronze mirror reads, "Lathia made me." A woman craftsperson, signing her work, asserting her identity as creator. Her name survives, though we know nothing else about her, not when she lived or where, not who she made the mirror for or what became of it before it ended up in a tomb. But her voice speaks across 2,500 years. I made this. I existed. Remember me. Another inscription, on a tomb at Caere. Ramtha Visnai, wife of Anth Tetni, daughter of Veltha Tlesna, lived 40 years. Not just a name, but relationships. A web of family connections that placed her in her community. She was someone's wife, someone's daughter. She lived 4 decades, long enough to see children grow if she had them, long enough to experience joy and sorrow, love and loss, all the experiences that make a life. What were those 4 decades like? The inscription does not say, but it testifies that they happened, that she mattered to someone who memorialized her. The sarcophagus of the spouses gives us another couple, unknown names but visible affection. The husband's arm draped across his wife's shoulders suggests intimacy, comfort, a partnership that extended beyond death. Their archaic smiles seem peaceful, content, as if death itself could not diminish what they shared. They look like they are having a conversation, paused mid-sentence for eternity. Who were they? What did they talk about? What made them laugh? The stone cannot tell us, but their postures suggest that whatever they had together, they valued it enough to carry it into whatever afterlife they believed awaited. In the house of the surgeon at Pompeii, centuries later, an Etruscan surgical kit was found, bronze instruments for cutting and cauterizing, probes and forceps, a speculum. Some physician carried these tools, used them to heal, or at least to try to heal. His name is lost. We do not know if he was successful, whether his patients lived or died, whether he was celebrated or merely tolerated. But the tools remain, testimony to someone who spent their life trying to mend bodies, to ease suffering, to fight against death, even though death always wins eventually. The painted tomb walls show feasts, yes, but also daily life. At Tarquinia, one tomb shows fishing and hunting. Men wade in water spearing fish. Others hunt birds with slings. A boy climbs a diving platform, ready to leap into the sea. These were the pleasures of life, the simple joys that made existence worthwhile. The people who commissioned these paintings wanted to remember not grand achievements, but simple happiness. The feeling of cool water on a hot day, the satisfaction of a successful hunt, the pleasure of fresh fish cooked over a fire. Another tomb shows athletes competing. Wrestlers grapple, their muscles straining with effort. Runners race toward a finish line, their bodies leaning forward with effort. A discus thrower winds up, preparing to release. These scenes celebrate physical prowess, the joy of competition, the pride of skilled bodies performing at their limits. Someone valued these moments enough to paint them for eternity, to say that this too was important, that strength and skill and the testing of oneself against others mattered. The woman buried in the Regolini Galassi tomb wore gold that took months to create, jewellery worked with techniques requiring extraordinary skill. But beneath the wealth and craftsmanship, she was a person. She woke up in the morning and chose what to wear. She spoke with others, laughed at jokes, worried about problems. She loved some people and disliked others. She had preferences opinions, dreams. All of that is lost. We have her jewelry but not her voice, her possessions but not her thoughts, her tomb but not her story. The tragedy of Etruscan disappearance is not abstract. It is the silencing of voices, the forgetting of names, the loss of stories. Thousands of people lived and loved and worked and died in Etruscan cities. They had hopes and fears, joys and sorrows, triumphs and failures. They were as fully human as anyone living today, their emotional lives as rich, their experiences as meaningful. But their voices are lost. We see traces in tomb paintings and inscriptions, fragments of lives that once were whole, echoes of conversations that once had context and meaning. The human element of Etruscan civilization is what makes its disappearance tragic, rather than merely historically interesting. These were not abstractions or statistics. These were people. The musician playing the lyre, the craftsperson signing the mirror, the couple reclining together, the physician with his tools, the dancer leaping with joy, the woman who lived 40 years and was loved enough to be memorialized. They lived in a culture that celebrated life, that granted women equality, that valued beauty and pleasure and human connection. And that culture vanished, taking their voices with it, leaving us only fragments and questions, and the sadness of knowing that once there were answers, once there were people who could tell us everything, but they are gone and cannot speak. Not all Etruscans accepted Roman dominance quietly. As the 2nd and 1st centuries before Christ unfolded, resistance flickered across Etruria like fires that could not quite be extinguished. The resistance was rarely military by this time. Open warfare had failed. The cities that fought Rome had been conquered or forced into submission. But resistance took other forms, quieter but no less determined. The refusal to simply disappear, the insistence on maintaining identity, even when political independence was lost. In Volsini, the resistance came from an unexpected source. The city had a long tradition of aristocratic rule, noble families governing according to ancient privilege. But as Roman power grew and social structures stressed, the lower classes began demanding change. Slaves and freedmen challenged their masters. Common citizens questioned aristocratic authority. The traditional order began breaking down, not from external conquest but from internal revolution. The Volsinii aristocrats, desperate to maintain power, made a fatal mistake. They appealed to Rome for help against their own people. Rome responded in 264 before Christ, but not as the aristocrats hoped. Roman legions arrived and crushed the uprising. Yes, but they also destroyed Volsinii itself. The city was razed, its population dispersed, its treasures looted. A new Volsinii was built at a different site, thoroughly Romanized, completely under Roman control. The aristocrats who invited Roman intervention lost everything they had tried to preserve. The lesson was clear. Appealing to Rome meant surrendering to Rome. There was no intermediate option, no way to use Roman power for local purposes without being consumed by it. But not everyone learned that lesson, or perhaps some learned a different lesson. In some cities, Etruscan families chose cultural resistance. They continued speaking Etruscan at home even as they used Latin in public. They maintained traditional religious practices even as Roman cults spread. They taught their children Etruscan history and mythology, even as Roman schools taught Latin literature. This quiet resistance could not preserve political independence, but it tried to preserve something deeper. Identity, memory, the sense of being Etruscan in a world increasingly Roman. The haruspices represented a particular form of resistance. These Etruscan priests, masters of divination, remained essential to Roman religious practice. Romans consulted them for state decisions, military campaigns, and interpreting omens. But the haruspices kept their sacred texts in Etruscan. The Libri Haruspicini, the books explaining divination techniques and their theological foundations, were never fully translated into Latin. The priests taught their craft in Etruscan, maintaining a domain where their language remained necessary and powerful. This created a paradox. Rome had conquered Etruria politically and was assimilating it culturally, but Roman religious practice depended on Etruscan expertise, transmitted in Etruscan language. For generations, this dependency gave Etruscan priests leverage and respect. They could not restore Etruscan independence, but they could maintain a sphere where Etruscan knowledge was superior to Roman, where conquerors needed conquered, where the old culture remained essential to the new order. Some resistance was more direct, if ultimately futile. During the Social War, in 91 to 88 before Christ, when Italian allies revolted against Rome demanding citizenship and equal rights, several Etruscan cities joined the rebellion. They had been Roman allies for generations, but alliance was not equality. Romans treated Italian allies as subordinates, demanding military service but granting few benefits. The rebellion sought to force Rome to treat its allies as partners rather than subjects. The war was brutal and destructive. Entire populations were mobilized, cities were besieged and sacked. The countryside was devastated. In the end, Rome won, but at such cost that it granted citizenship to the rebels, achieving through victory what the war had been fought over. The Etruscan cities that participated gained Roman citizenship, which sounds like success but was actually the final step in assimilation. As Roman citizens, Etruscans were legally equal but culturally subsumed. The price of political equality was cultural dissolution. Some families resisted through memory and pride. Maecenas, the wealthy patron of poets during Augustus's reign, was descended from Etruscan kings. He took pride in this ancestry, maintained Etruscan customs, collected Etruscan art and antiquities. His patronage supported Virgil and Horace, poets who wrote in Latin for Roman audiences, but Maecenas himself represented a living link to the conquered culture. He could not restore Etruscan independence, but he could insist that Etruscan heritage was worth remembering and honouring. The Emperor Claudius, ruling from 41 to 54 after Christ, wrote a history of the Etruscans in 20 volumes. The work is lost, known only through references in other sources, but its existence suggests that even in imperial times, Etruscan history remained interesting and important enough to warrant comprehensive treatment. Claudius was fascinated by languages and ancient cultures. His first wife was Etruscan, from the Plauti family, and some scholars speculate that she influenced his interest in her ancestral culture. But by Claudius's time, Etruscan was dying. Few people still spoke it as a native language. The sacred texts remained, preserved by conservative priests, but they were becoming incomprehensible even to those who used them. The language survived in ritual formulas and religious contexts, divorced from daily use, maintained as a sacred tongue like Latin in medieval churches, used but not truly living. Within a generation or two, even the priests would be reading phonetically, pronouncing words whose meanings they had forgotten. The last known Etruscan inscription dates to the 1st century after Christ. It is short, formulaic, a tomb marker giving a name. After that, silence. No more inscriptions, no more texts, no more evidence that anyone was writing Etruscan. The language had become entirely oral, if it survived at all, and oral languages leave no records. When the last native speaker died, the language died completely, taking with it 3,000 years of linguistic evolution and cultural expression. Some resistance was purely symbolic. Etruscan aristocrats in Roman times might name a son using traditional Etruscan names, maintaining nomenclature even when language was lost. They might commission tomb art in traditional styles, or collect Etruscan antiquities, or support scholars studying Etruscan history. These gestures could not revive the culture, but they insisted that it mattered, that it was worth remembering, that being descended from Etruscans was the source of pride rather than shame. The resistance, in all its forms, ultimately failed. The language died, the culture was assimilated, the identity dissolved into Roman citizenship, the political independence never returned. By the 2nd century after Christ, Etruria was simply a region of Italy, no different from any other Roman province, its people speaking Latin, worshipping Roman gods, living Roman lives. The resistance had delayed but not prevented the inevitable transformation from Etruscan to Roman. Yet the resistance mattered. It prolonged the survival of Etruscan language and culture for generations beyond what conquest alone would have allowed. It preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost entirely. The haruspices' insistence on maintaining their texts in Etruscan meant that when Renaissance scholars began studying the language, they had religious texts to work from. The aristocratic families' pride in their ancestry meant that historians knew Etruscan civilization had existed and was important. The resistance did not save the Etruscans, but it left enough traces that rediscovery became possible. The tragedy is not that the resistance failed. The tragedy is that it was necessary at all, that a civilization had to fight simply to be remembered, that people had to resist just to preserve the fact that they had existed. The Etruscans built cities and created art, developed engineering techniques and religious systems, lived rich lives, and created sophisticated culture. All of that should have been enough to ensure their memory. But the conqueror writes the history, and Rome chose to minimize and forget its Etruscan heritage. The resistance, quiet and ultimately futile, was the attempt to insist on truth against power, memory against forgetting, identity against erasure. The year 1828 marked a turning point in how Europe understood the Etruscans. The British Museum acquired a spectacular painted tomb from Tarquinia, the tomb of the painted vases, and put it on public display in London. Thousands came to see it, marvelling at the vivid colours, the graceful figures, the scenes of life and death painted 2,500 years earlier. The exhibition sparked something deeper than curiosity. It sparked recognition that the Etruscans were not merely interesting antiquities, but representatives of a major civilization that deserved serious study. The Romantic movement in art and literature embraced the Etruscans with enthusiasm. To Romantic sensibilities, the Etruscans represented everything appealing: a lost civilization, mysterious and sophisticated, conquered but culturally superior to its conquerors, celebratory of life and beauty in ways that contrasted with stern Roman virtue. The tomb frescoes, with their banqueting couples and dancing figures, seemed to show a culture that valued joy over duty, pleasure over conquest, human connection over military glory. The poet D.H. Lawrence, visiting Etruscan sites in 1927, wrote with passionate admiration about what he found. His book, Etruscan Places, described the tombs as revelations, windows into a vanished world where people lived more fully and freely than in modern industrial society. Lawrence romanticized the Etruscans shamelessly, projecting his own values and critiques of modernity onto ancient tombs. But his enthusiasm was infectious, and his book introduced thousands of readers to Etruscan civilization. The Etruscans were vividly alive, Lawrence wrote, and the phallic consciousness was there in everything. He saw in Etruscan art a vitality and connection to nature that he felt modern civilization had lost. His interpretations were often more about Lawrence than the Etruscans, but they captured something real. The tomb art did show a culture that celebrated life, that depicted human bodies with affection rather than shame, that seemed comfortable with mortality because it embraced existence so fully. Archaeological method advanced dramatically in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Excavations became systematic, with careful recording of context and stratigraphy. Scholars began publishing comprehensive catalogues of Etruscan inscriptions, making the corpus available for linguistic study. Museums organized their Etruscan collections, labeling artifacts properly, preserving context. The discipline of Etruscology emerged, with dedicated scholars, specialized journals, and international conferences focused entirely on Etruscan studies. New discoveries continued reshaping understanding. In 1953, the tomb of the warrior at Tarquinia was opened, revealing frescoes of extraordinary quality showing armed processions and ritual scenes. In 1964, the Piaggi tablets provided the bilingual text that helped unlock aspects of Etruscan language and religion. In 1968, excavations at Merlo uncovered an archaic aristocratic residence, decorated with terracotta friezes showing processions, banquets, and assemblies, revealing aspects of Etruscan political and social life previously unknown. The scholarly awakening brought new questions and debates. If Etruscan women had higher status than Greek or early Roman women, what did that mean for understanding ancient gender relations? If Etruscan religion differed fundamentally from Greek and Roman religion, how should we understand Mediterranean religious development? If Etruscan art showed different values than Greek art, what did that reveal about the diversity of ancient cultures? The Etruscans became a case study in questioning assumptions about the ancient world. DNA analysis in the late 20th and early 21st centuries brought scientific tools to the origin debate. Multiple studies extracted ancient DNA from Etruscan remains and compared it to modern populations. The results were complex and sometimes contradictory, but they generally suggested genetic continuity with other ancient Italian populations, challenging the migration theory. Yet some studies found genetic markers suggesting Eastern Mediterranean connections, keeping the debate alive. Science could answer some questions, but not all, and interpretation of genetic data remained contested. Italy itself experienced an Etruscan awakening. The region of Tuscany, whose name derives from Tusci, another Latin name for the Etruscans, began promoting its Etruscan heritage. Museums in Tarquinia, Volterra, Chiusi, and other ancient cities expanded their collections and improved their displays. Tourist routes highlighted Etruscan sites. Schools taught local history that emphasized pre-Roman civilization. The Etruscans became a source of regional pride, a way for modern Tuscans to claim a heritage older and perhaps more sophisticated than Rome. The cultural renaissance extended to popular culture. Novelists wrote fiction set in Etruscan times. Documentary filmmakers produced programs about Etruscan discoveries. Video games and movies used Etruscan settings and characters. This popularization was not always accurate, often sensationalizing mysteries and downplaying scholarly consensus, but it spread awareness that the Etruscans existed and mattered. Millions of people who would never read academic journals encountered the Etruscans through popular media. Academic programs in Etruscan studies proliferated. Universities in Italy, Germany, Britain, and the United States established research centers dedicated to Etruscan archaeology, linguistics, and art history. International conferences brought together scholars to share discoveries and debate interpretations. Journals published research in multiple languages. The field became truly international, with American, European, and increasingly Asian scholars contributing to understanding. Digital technology revolutionized the field in the 21st century. High-resolution photography documented tomb frescoes in detail, impossible before. 3D scanning created precise records of artifacts and sites. Computer databases organized thousands of inscriptions for linguistic analysis. Virtual reality allowed people to explore Etruscan tombs without physically visiting them. Ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies located new sites without excavation. Digital humanities tools analyzed patterns in art and text that human researchers might miss. Conservation became a major focus of the Renaissance. Many tomb frescoes discovered in the 18th and 19th centuries had deteriorated badly from exposure. Modern conservation techniques tried to stabilize what remained and slow further decay. Some tombs were closed to public access, with replicas built nearby so tourists could see reproductions while originals were protected. Climate control systems were installed in museums. The goal was not just to study the Etruscans, but to preserve what remained for future generations. The awakening also brought ethical considerations. Many Etruscan artifacts in museums were acquired through unethical or illegal means, looted from tombs by tomb robbers and sold to collectors. Italy began demanding the return of looted artifacts, and some museums complied, returning pieces to their places of origin. The debate over cultural property, who owns the past and who has the right to display it, became central to Etruscan studies as to archaeology generally. Educational outreach expanded. Museums developed programs for schools, teaching children about the Etruscans through hands-on activities and interactive exhibits. Archaeological sites offered guided tours explaining Etruscan history in accessible language. Books written for general audiences made scholarly research available beyond academia. The goal was democratizing knowledge, making the Etruscans known not just to specialists, but to anyone curious about the past. By the early 21st century, the Etruscan Renaissance had achieved something remarkable. A civilization that had been nearly forgotten, reduced to footnotes in Roman history, had been rediscovered and restored to its rightful place as a major ancient culture. Museums held extensive collections. Scholars had decoded much of the language and reconstructed significant aspects of history and culture. The origin debates continued, but within a framework of solid evidence rather than pure speculation, the Etruscans were no longer an enigma. They were a known civilization, complex and fascinating, important and influential. Yet mysteries remained. The language was still incompletely understood. Many sites remained unexcavated. Questions about social structure, political organization, daily life, and religious belief remained only partially answered. The awakening had illuminated much, but not everything. The Etruscans still held secrets, still presented puzzles, still resisted complete understanding. Perhaps that was fitting. A civilization that had maintained its distinctiveness in life, resisted full comprehension in death, remaining enigmatic even as it became known, mysterious even as it was revealed. The revelation at the heart of the Etruscan enigma is simple to state and profound to understand. The Etruscans did not disappear because they were weak or primitive or inferior. They disappeared because they were conquered by a power that systematically erased their identity while absorbing their culture. The mechanism of their disappearance was not destruction but assimilation, not genocide but cultural absorption, not sudden catastrophe but gradual transformation over generations until nothing distinctively Etruscan remained, except objects in tombs and inscriptions no one could read. This is the truth that challenges comfortable narratives about history. We like to think civilizations fall because they deserve to fall, because they were weak or corrupt or decadent. We tell stories about decline and fall that make defeat seem inevitable, even just. But the Etruscan story reveals a different truth. Civilizations can be sophisticated, creative, and culturally advanced, and still disappear. Success does not guarantee survival. Cultural superiority does not prevent conquest. A civilization can teach its neighbors, influence its conquerors, and still be erased from memory. The Romans learned from the Etruscans, adopted their techniques, absorbed their religious practices, took their engineering and architecture and urban planning. Then Rome conquered Etruria, suppressed the Etruscan language, and wrote histories that minimized or denigrated Etruscan achievements. The student defeated the teacher and then claimed the teacher's knowledge as its own. This is not unique to Rome and Etruria, it is a pattern that repeats throughout history. But the Etruscan case is particularly clear, particularly well documented, particularly complete. The revelation extends to how we understand cultural survival. The Etruscans maintained their identity for centuries after losing political independence. Families spoke Etruscan at home, priests preserved sacred texts, aristocrats took pride in their ancestry. The culture did not die the moment Roman armies conquered Etruscan cities. It survived for generations, gradually fading as political reality made assimilation advantageous and maintaining distinctiveness difficult. The final disappearance took centuries, not years. This slow erasure matters because it reveals agency. The Etruscans did not simply vanish. They made choices, individually and collectively, about whether to maintain their language and identity or adopt Roman language and identity. Some chose resistance, preserving what they could. Others chose adaptation, gaining advantages in the Roman system by surrendering distinctiveness. Both choices were rational responses to political reality. Both contributed to the ultimate disappearance. The tragedy is not that people made wrong choices. The tragedy is that they were forced to choose at all. The revelation about women's status in Etruscan society challenges assumptions about progress. We like to think gender equality is a modern achievement, that ancient societies were uniformly patriarchal, that women's rights improved steadily over time. But Etruscan women, 2,500 years ago, attended banquets with men, owned property independently, had their names recorded on inscriptions, were depicted in art as equals to their husbands. This equality was not universal in the ancient world. It was distinctly Etruscan, and it disappeared when Rome conquered Etruria and imposed Roman patriarchal structures. This means progress is not inevitable. Rights can be lost as easily as gained. A society can move from greater gender equality to less, rather than always progressing toward more. The Etruscan case proves that social arrangements are contingent, that different cultures make different choices, that what seems natural and inevitable is actually historically specific and culturally constructed. The revelation unsettles teleological narratives about history moving in a single direction toward modern values. The religious revelation cuts equally deep. Etruscan religion was not primitive superstition but a coherent theological system with its own logic and sophistication. The divination practices, the reading of lightning and livers, rested on beliefs about how gods communicated with humans and how humans could interpret divine will. The system was complex enough to require years of training and extensive sacred texts. Romans adopted these practices but never fully understood the underlying theology, treating them as useful techniques divorced from their original meaning. This reveals something about cultural transmission. Practices can survive while their contexts are lost. Techniques can be adopted while their purposes are forgotten. Future generations can use what past generations created without understanding why it was created or what it originally meant. The Etruscan religious practices survived in Roman hands, but as tools rather than as expressions of belief. The revelation is that cultural survival is not the same as cultural continuity. Forms can persist while meanings are lost. The linguistic revelation is perhaps most profound. The Etruscan language was a living, evolving, sophisticated means of communication for over 1,000 years. It had literature, though we have none. It had poetry, though we cannot read it. It had philosophy, religious texts, histories, songs, jokes, everyday conversations. All of that is gone. The language died so completely that we have only fragments, formulaic inscriptions and partial translations, enough to tantalize but not enough to truly understand. This reveals the fragility of human communication. A language can die, taking with it all the thoughts expressed in it, all the nuances and wordplay and cultural references that make meaning possible. When Etruscan died, 3,000 years of linguistic evolution ended. Every idiom, every metaphor, every shade of meaning was lost. The last speaker died, and with them died the ability to fully understand every Etruscan text ever written. The revelation is that language death is cultural death, that when a language disappears, an entire way of thinking disappears with it. The archaeological revelation concerns bias in historical sources. For centuries, scholars relied primarily on Roman written sources for information about the Etruscans. Those sources were biased, written by conquerors about the conquered, designed to justify conquest by depicting the conquered as inferior. Archaeology revealed a different story. The tombs, the artifacts, the cities showed a sophisticated civilization that Roman texts had minimized and misrepresented. The revelation is that physical evidence can contradict written sources, that we must question who wrote history and why. Matters beyond Etruscan studies. Every historical source is biased. Every text reflects its author's perspective, agenda, cultural assumptions. The victors write history, and they write it to justify their victories. Understanding the past requires recognizing bias, seeking alternative sources, questioning dominant narratives. The Etruscan case provides a clear example where archaeology revealed what texts concealed, where physical evidence contradicted written history, where the conquered's material culture spoke truth that the conqueror's words had obscured. The final revelation concerns memory and forgetting. The Etruscans were forgotten almost completely for 2,000 years. A major civilization, sophisticated and influential, was reduced to scattered mentions in Roman texts and ruins no one understood. They were forgotten because Rome wanted them forgotten, because acknowledging Etruscan contributions would diminish Roman achievement. The revelation is that forgetting is often intentional, that cultures erase inconvenient pasts, that what we do not remember is sometimes what we chose not to remember. But the revelation also includes rediscovery. The Etruscans were forgotten but not lost forever. Archaeological work recovered their material culture. Linguistic analysis partially decoded their language. Historical research reconstructed their civilization. What was forgotten was remembered again. The revelation includes hope, that forgotten peoples can be rediscovered, that lost voices can speak again through artifacts and ruins, that history can be recovered even when it has been deliberately erased. The deepest truth is that the Etruscans matter not just as a historical curiosity, but as a lesson. They teach us that sophisticated civilizations can disappear, that cultural superiority does not guarantee survival, that progress is not inevitable, that languages and identities can be lost, that history is written by victors, but can be corrected by archaeology, that forgetting is often deliberate but rediscovery is possible. They teach us to question narratives, to seek alternative sources, to listen for silenced voices. They teach us that the past is more complex than we assume, that the people we forget were as human as we are, and that remembering them matters because forgetting is a form of death that archaeology can resist. Sit quietly for a moment and consider what it means that an entire civilization can vanish, not just individual people, which happens constantly, or even whole generations, which is the nature of time, but an entire culture, a language, a way of seeing the world, a set of beliefs and practices, and artistic traditions developed over centuries. The Etruscans existed for roughly 600 years as a distinct civilization. 25 generations lived and died speaking Etruscan, building cities according to Etruscan principles, worshipping Etruscan gods, creating Etruscan art, and then it ended, so completely that, 2,000 years later, we struggle to understand even the basics of their language. This should unsettle us. We live in cultures that feel permanent, speaking languages that seem eternal, following traditions that we assume will continue indefinitely. But the Etruscans thought that too. They built cities meant to last forever. They carved tombs to preserve memory for eternity. They wrote texts, assuming future generations would read them. All of those assumptions proved wrong. Their cities became Roman. Their tombs were sealed and forgotten. Their texts became undecipherable. Nothing is as permanent as it feels. The Etruscan disappearance raises questions about identity. What does it mean to be Etruscan, or Roman, or anything else? Identity feels essential, core to who we are, but the Etruscan story reveals how contingent it is. Etruscan families who accepted Roman citizenship and raised their children speaking Latin were making pragmatic choices. Within a generation or two, their descendants were simply Roman. The Etruscan identity, which had seemed so fundamental, could be surrendered or lost. This suggests that identity is not fixed, but performed, not inherited, but maintained through practice. When practice stops, identity fades. This has implications for our time. We live in an era of globalizing culture, where local languages and traditions compete with dominant languages and global media. The mechanisms that erased Etruscan, political pressure, and practical advantage in adopting the conqueror's language and culture still operate today. Languages die constantly, usually small languages spoken by communities that find more advantage in adopting national or global languages. Each death is an Etruscan disappearance in miniature, a way of seeing the world lost, a linguistic and cultural heritage erased. But the Etruscan story also reveals the possibility of resistance and preservation. The haruspices maintained sacred texts in Etruscan for generations after the language was otherwise dying. Aristocratic families preserved pride in Etruscan ancestry. These efforts could not save the language or culture completely, but they prolonged survival and preserved knowledge that made eventual rediscovery possible. This suggests that resistance matters, even when it cannot fully succeed, because it preserves options for the future. What is completely lost cannot be recovered. What is partially preserved can be studied and remembered. The gender equality revealed in Etruscan society should make us think carefully about progress. We assume history moves toward greater equality, that ancient societies were uniformly oppressive to women, and modernity is liberating. But Etruscan women 2,500 years ago had rights that Roman women would not have, that medieval Italian women would not have, that women in many places would not have until modern times. Progress is not a line moving steadily upward. It is a complex process of gains and losses, where some societies are more egalitarian than others, where rights can be lost as well as won, where what seems primitive might be advanced, and what seems advanced might be regressive. This matters for how we think about social change. If progress is not inevitable, if equality once achieved can be lost, then maintaining rights requires vigilance. The Etruscan women who attended banquets as equals probably did not imagine their great-great-granddaughters living under Roman patriarchal restrictions. They probably assumed their social system would continue. They were wrong. This teaches us that social arrangements must be actively maintained, that rights not defended can be lost, that nothing is guaranteed simply because it exists now. The religious aspects of Etruscan culture prompt reflection on how we understand belief. The divination practices seem strange to modern secular minds, reading divine will in lightning and livers. But these were sophisticated interpretive systems, internally coherent, resting on theological foundations we can only partially reconstruct. Dismissing them as superstition misses the point. Every culture has beliefs that seem obvious to insiders and strange to outsiders. The Etruscans' religious practices made sense within their worldview, just as our practices make sense within ours. Understanding them requires suspending judgment and trying to see the world as they saw it. This exercise in understanding has broader implications. Every culture makes sense from within, rests on assumptions its members take for granted. Understanding other cultures, whether ancient or contemporary, requires recognizing our own assumptions and being willing to question them. The Etruscan religious system seems exotic because we do not share its premises, but from within those premises, it was logical and coherent. This suggests that what seems strange or irrational in other cultures is often simply based on different starting assumptions, and that understanding requires empathy rather than judgment. The completeness of Etruscan erasure teaches lessons about power and history. Rome did not just conquer Etruria militarily, it conquered it culturally, replacing Etruscan identity with Roman identity, Etruscan language with Latin, Etruscan history with Roman narratives. This was possible because Rome controlled not just territory, but also education, literature, and historical writing. The victors literally wrote the history, and they wrote themselves as heroes, and the conquered as footnotes or barbarians. This pattern repeats constantly in history. Those with power define the narrative. But archaeology provides a check on power's narrative. The tombs spoke a different truth than Roman texts. The artifacts revealed a sophistication that Roman writers had denied or minimized. Physical evidence can contradict written sources, can expose bias and propaganda, can recover voices that power tried to silence. This suggests that seeking alternative sources, questioning dominant narratives, and listening for silenced voices are not just academic exercises but moral necessities. History belongs not just to the powerful but to everyone, and recovering forgotten histories is an act of justice. The Etruscan story also prompts reflection on what we value. The tomb frescoes celebrate banquets and dancing, music and athletics, pleasure and human connection. Etruscan culture seems to have valued joy, beauty, and life itself. This contrasts with Roman martial virtue, the emphasis on duty and conquest that defined Roman identity. Neither value system is inherently superior, but the contrast is instructive. Cultures choose what to emphasize, what to celebrate, what to teach their children. These choices shape how people live and what they value. The Etruscans made different choices than Rome, and those choices are visible in the art they left behind. What do we celebrate? What do our monuments and art emphasize when archaeologists excavate our ruins 2,000 years from now? What will they conclude we valued? These are not idle questions. They are invitations to examine how we live, what we teach, what we preserve, and what we discard. The Etruscans leave us not just a historical puzzle, but a mirror reflecting our own choices and values. Finally, the Etruscan story is about memory and obligation. They built a civilization, created beauty, developed technologies, lived fully human lives. They deserve to be remembered, not just because they influenced Rome, not just because they solved the archaeological puzzle, but because they existed and their existence had meaning. Every person who lived in Etruscan cities was as fully human as we are, experienced joy and suffering, loved and feared, hoped and dreamed. They are gone, but memory can honor them. Study can recover their voices, however partially. Remembering is an act of acknowledgement that their lives mattered. We are the ones who remember. The Etruscans cannot speak for themselves. Their language is dead, their culture absorbed, their voices silent. We are their only voice now, those of us who study their remains, who visit their tombs, who read about them, who honor their memory. This is responsibility as much as interest. We owe it to them, and to all forgotten peoples, to remember as truly as we can, to resist simplification and caricature, to acknowledge complexity and humanity. The Etruscans were not just enigmas or lessons or interesting puzzles. They were people. Remembering them as people is the most important reflection of all. The hills of Tuscany roll beneath a sunset sky much as they did 2,500 years ago. The olive groves spread across slopes where Etruscan farmers once worked. Medieval towns perch on heights where Etruscan cities once stood. The Tiber River flows past Rome, as it flowed past the villages that became that city, carrying water from mountains to sea as it has for eternity. The landscape endures while civilizations rise and fall upon it. But beneath the surface, the Etruscans remain. Their tombs lie sealed in hillsides, thousands excavated, thousands more awaiting discovery. Their cities form foundations for modern settlements, Etruscan walls supporting medieval towers, ancient streets buried under modern pavement. Their engineering works still function, drainage tunnels still carrying water after 2 millennia. They are gone but not entirely gone, present in absence, speaking through silence. Walk through the Museo Nazionale Etrusco in Rome's Villa Giulia and you walk among their legacy. The sarcophagus of the spouses still shows that ancient couple in their eternal embrace, his arm across her shoulders, both smiling their archaic smiles. The gesture transcends time. Whatever language they spoke, whatever gods they worshipped, they loved each other enough to be buried together. And that love speaks across 25 centuries, directly to anyone who has loved. The specific culture is lost, but the universal humanity remains. The Apollo of Veii stands in its case, powerful and serene, a god captured in terracotta by an artist whose name we will never know. The workmanship equals anything Greece produced, the artistic vision as sophisticated as any ancient culture achieved. This was not made by primitives or barbarians. This was made by a civilization at its height, confident in its beliefs, skilled in its crafts, creating beauty that still moves viewers millennia later. The artist is forgotten, but the art remains. The gold jewellery from Cerveteri still gleams. The granulation work still baffles modern jewellers, trying to understand how it was made. Techniques developed 2,700 years ago were so advanced they were lost and only recently rediscovered. The craftspeople who made these pieces were masters, and their mastery speaks through gold that has not tarnished, beauty that has not faded, skill that has not been equalled. They are gone, but their work testifies they existed and excelled. The painted tombs at Tarquinia, those that remain viewable, still show their frescoes. The colours have faded somewhat, the environment has damaged them despite best conservation efforts, but they still speak. The banqueters still recline, the musicians still play, the dancers still leap in joy. These paintings were meant for the dead, for eternity, and they have achieved a kind of eternity, outlasting the civilization that created them, witnessed now by people whose ancestors the Etruscans never knew existed. The language itself, though incompletely understood, still exists in thousands of inscriptions. Scholars still study them, still debate meanings, still try to unlock remaining mysteries. Each generation brings new tools, new methods, new perspectives. Computer analysis finds patterns previous generations missed. Comparative linguistics suggests connections earlier scholars did not see. The study continues. The puzzle remains engaging, and perhaps someday we will read Etruscan fluently. Until then, we have fragments, and fragments are better than nothing. The legacy extends beyond museums and archaeological sites. Every time someone walks under an arch, they walk under an Etruscan legacy, transmitted through Rome. Every time someone reads this text, written in an alphabet, descended from the one Etruscans adapted from Greek, they encounter that legacy. The urban planning of cities worldwide owes debt to principles the Etruscans developed. The religious practices that shaped Christianity passed through Roman religion, which absorbed Etruscan theology. The legacy is everywhere, usually unrecognized, woven into daily life so thoroughly it seems natural rather than cultural. Modern Tuscany embraces its Etruscan heritage. Museums in Volterra, Chiusi, Cortona, and Tarquinia showcase local finds, telling the story of the people who lived in these places before Rome, before the Middle Ages, before modernity. School children learn about the Etruscans as part of their regional history. Tour guides lead groups through painted tombs and ruined cities. The Etruscans have become a source of local identity, a way for Tuscans to claim a heritage older and perhaps more sophisticated than Rome's. But the greatest legacy might be simply the story itself, the lesson the Etruscans teach by their disappearance. They remind us that civilizations are fragile, that sophistication does not guarantee survival, that languages can die, that cultures can be erased, that what seems permanent is temporary. They teach us to value what we have while we have it, to preserve what can be preserved, to record what can be recorded, because nothing lasts forever and forgetting is always possible. They also teach us that forgetting is not final. The Etruscans were forgotten for 2 millennia, but they were not lost forever. Archaeology recovered their material culture. Scholarship reconstructed their history. Memory was restored, however imperfectly. This is the other lesson, that effort can recover what was lost, that forgotten voices can speak again, that the past can be reclaimed, even when it has been deliberately erased. The work requires patience, dedication, respect, but it is possible. The enigma of the Etruscans, that mystery that has fascinated scholars for 2 centuries, may never be completely solved. We may never read their language fluently. We may never know exactly where they came from. We may never fully understand their religious beliefs or social structures. Some mysteries are too deeply buried, too thoroughly erased for complete recovery. But partial knowledge is valuable. Incomplete understanding is better than ignorance. We know enough to honor them, enough to recognize their achievements, enough to mourn their loss. And perhaps the enigma is appropriate. A civilization that maintained its distinctiveness in life, that resisted cultural homogenization, that preserved its unique identity for centuries, remains distinctive in death. The Etruscans will not yield all their secrets easily. They remain mysterious, enigmatic, fascinating. They draw us into study, spark our curiosity, challenge our assumptions. They make us work to understand them. And in that work, we learn not just about them, but about how to approach the past with humility and respect. The sun sets over the Tuscan hills, as it has set for billions of years and will set for billions more. The landscape endures. The Etruscans are gone, but their legacy remains in stone and memory, in museums and ruins, in techniques still used and art still admired, in questions still asked and mysteries still pondered. They built cities and tombs, created art and language, lived and loved and died. They were forgotten and remembered. And in being remembered, however imperfectly, they achieved the immortality they painted on tomb walls, life continuing beyond death, memory conquering oblivion, humanity transcending time. Let us remember them, not perfectly, because perfection is impossible across such distance, not completely, because completeness is beyond our reach, but remember them nonetheless, the people who built cities before Rome, who granted women equality before modernity, who celebrated life in the face of death, who spoke a language that died with them, who were conquered and forgotten and rediscovered. The Etruscans. May their memory endure as long as people wonder about the past and honor those who came before.